Welcome to episode 2 of An Understanding. This episode will be about John Adams. If you like it, listen. If you don't, so be it. This will be a deep dive on his life, legacy, etc., etc. Hope you all enjoy. Who is John Adams? Well, weird voice that I keep doing for some reason. John Adams is our second president, and one of the most fascinating founding fathers of all time. And one whose legacy has been really hurt in a lot of aspects, in a lot of ways, just for a multitude of reasons. Because, I think outside of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, I don't think most people know the significance of a lot of the other founding fathers for the most part. I mean, most people don't even know who the hell James Monroe even is, even though he's our fifth president. But John Adams is an example of someone who I think is like a top tier founding father. If you had to rank them, he'd be up there, but he'd be like definitely a tier below, say, Washington and Jefferson in terms of historical legacy and how we remember and perceive them. Even though he actually probably had one of the most fundamental founding building blocks that would actually... He's the single most, outside of Washington, in my view, and the single most important founding father in terms of actually saving and winning the revolution, and at the very least the fundamental founding and core, I would say, in some ways, of the Constitution, the creation of the Constitution in many aspects. And I'll get to my reasons for it in a little bit when I explain his life and everything about that. But I'd like to start off by asking and saying, why is his legacy so hampered for someone that I think so highly of? It's complicated. When you really look at some of the writings, for instance, of how a lot of the founding fathers really, looked at him, how they perceived him, it wasn't very positive. A lot of it was just because of his personality. I'll get to that in just a second. And the other aspect, too, was in a very complicated presidency, and I think a very complicated time within the federal government in general, that I think really was a very difficult time and ruined a lot of relationships and really just ruined who he was in what I think a lot of people perceived as a, push for excessive power of the federal government and the federal powers. It's a very difficult time, too, and I think his presidency is a very controversial and one that I think really would effectively ruin a lot of the potential for federalists to rule and run, which is unfortunate. I can't explain his personality, to be honest with you. The best way I can explain it, though, if I would attempt, is, because you have to compare him to other people and other presidents. And when I was doing my research into George Washington and John Adams, they're both diametrically different in a very unique way. And what I mean by that is, Washington is a very simple man in a very complex and complicated way, and John Adams is a very complicated and complex man in a very simple way. They're diametrically opposed in those ways. And the best way I can explain it is this, okay? When you look into George Washington, he's a very simple man. There's really nothing deeper than what you really get with Washington. He might have held some things close to the vest, and he wasn't a very talkative person, and a lot of his writings, they're not very detailed, but I think that was on purpose. He's a very intelligent man, but a very simple man in how he was going about his life, etc., everything, And the reason why I think he's simple is because of a multitude of complex things, things he observed and saw during his upbringing. He had 15 different father figures in his life, ultimately, that would really shape him. A lot of events that would really shape him to be the kind of person that he is. And Adams is kind of the opposite. He's a very simple man at his core, because when I look at Adams, I see one thing, and I see the heart and personality of someone who's just a natural born rebel. That's the only way I can explain it, And everything that happens in his life, his personality, etc., is really just branched off from this rebellious nature that he has, for the most part. When I say a rebel, it's just even from the get-go in his early going, he's always trying to prove something. He's always trying to right wrongs. He's always going against somebody. Whether it's his school teacher who would name him like this mischievous child, his relationship with his father, who he loved, but he was always rebellious against. And even like in his later and older age, he's basically just challenging people. He's pushing people. He's always right. And I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm going to do this, And like everything stems from that rebellious nature, his personality, his brashness, specific moments in his time where it's literally it's very simple that it's just Adams, the rebel, incarnate, And I think in a lot of instances that could be really good, but unfortunately, especially during his time, I guess you could say in the federal office for the most part as vice president, it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Like the best way I could explain John Adams is he's just this person that in a very, I guess, specifically like Virginian kind of like Victorian, like people back then weren't brash. They always beat around the bush, like, Timmy, did you do this or do that, or to lead the conversation into a particular, direction. And Adams is just a blunt person, and he's just like, hey, fuckface, like we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, this is gonna happen. I'm not going to beat around the bush, and a lot of people did not like that. I think the only other person that really appreciated it was Hamilton in some instances, but at the same time, they don't like each other. So it really depends on perspective, I guess. And it's tough. Because, when I look at John Adams, I look at a man who he gets so put through the ringer because of just, unfortunate historical legacy and people just downing him regardless. Even after he's dead, people still down him. And it's unfortunate. Because he's also, in my personal view, truly the most principled founding father, outside of obviously Washington in many aspects and ways. But when I look at John Adams, I look at someone, and in fairness, not principled when he's a president. It's complicated, but I'll explain why. But for the most part, a very principled individual. When he believes in something, he believes in it, even if he's right or wrong, and he go about doing it. And he's just someone that happens to believe in a lot of the similar things that a lot of the good things that I think a lot of people would think of in terms of the moral rights and the right thing. A lot of the founding principles of this country, morally speaking, I think are Adams' founding fundamental principles. Because he was a big advocate of republicanism and basically a constitutional republic for the most part. And a lot of his ideals, actually, I would say, made it to the Constitution itself and what it represents, One example, I would argue, that explains why I think he's a principled person and, the big reason why he's a big influence in the Constitution in some aspects is, he was a representative in the council for the people in the Boston Massacre, which is something people don't know. I think it's really interesting because I knew that when I was going to school, but a lot of people don't realize that. And then when you actually get into the nitty-gritty details about that particular moment, it's kind of fascinating how it went about. And I'd like to paint that picture for you just for a little bit. Imagine, it's 1770, March of 1770. The Boston Massacre just happened. You're John Adams Jr., your dad's the senior, named after your dad. And, you're this rising patriot lawyer from the country. You had moved your family recently from Braintree, Quincy to Boston, because you're getting a lot of your clients there. A lot of British negativity and a lot of interactions between the colonists and the British. Sparking a lot of work for you. Excuse me, tacos. Oh, excuse me, goddamn tacos. Carni's out, I'm telling you. Okay. Anyways, I'm losing my train of thought. You're getting a lot of work there. You're one of the most rising, prominent lawyers at that particular point in time, and you just said, screw it, we're going to move the entire family there. You move into this small house, it's rickety, pointless, and your wife's a little bit mad. So then you move to the other house, or Abby goes mad, you move to this bigger house, and everyone's happy. And you're just happy to have your family there. It's growing, John Quincy Adams, his son, is about two or three at this point, and you're getting a lot of work. Things are good. People aren't happy in Boston as the rising British interference at this point is so paramount that it's basically making things just untenable with the people and the civilians at that point, and leading to a lot of tensions, which culminated in the Boston Massacre. So you're at home one day, and then you get a knock on your door, and in this case, you're John Adams. I'm saying, think in his shoes, John Adams, for all y'all. You know, you gotta knock on the door, and then bam, this British person comes up, and he's like, hey. I think he's a British mercantile individual who's working for the British people, a representative for them. He's come with a couple people, and he's basically like, hey, Mr. Adams, can you please do this? You know, we've asked everyone around town, and normally we wouldn't ask you because you're this patriot person, but no one's going to help these people, and we need somebody to represent them. You know, he thinks for a second, and after a moment of taking, you know, just thinking about it, he accepts. Because that's John Adams. You have to understand, this is a big moment because no one's going to take this. You know, first off, it's political suicide at that point because everyone is anti-British there. His own cousin Samuel's leading riots, trying to lynch these people. You know, would lead riots over the next couple months. Because you have to understand, too, this wasn't like the trial happened the next week. No, this happened 6 months later when people are mad. People are just, and, you know, Samuel's doing protests every single fucking day for the most part. It's political suicide. You're a patriot. You're a rising patriot. You know, you have this little Republican newsletter that you're trying to do and doing essays on republicanism under the synonym of Humphrey Plowjogger. That's real, people. And that's beautiful. And this guy's a fucking unit Chad. Okay, he's awesome. Just for that alone. Anyways, it's suicide. You know, people aren't going to be happy. In fact, he would have to move his family out literally within like 8 months after the trial's over, just so that, you know, they can flee safety. Some people will basically, some historians and some people wrote down that that's just better for the family and whatnot, but I'm like, you're not leaving Boston for no reason. Okay, your life's good there. You know, there was real fear. And he did not like the British. He did not like the British at all. I don't want to say he hated them, but he believed that the British were not a very good thing. And I think a lot of his political ideals at that time with the British were a little bit complicated. But for him to do that, to fundamentally give these men the right to counsel, because no man should not be without counsel, I think is incredible. It's an important moment, and it shows the level of character that this man has. So, you know, 6 months later, because again, like I said, 6 months, he's trying to compile all the witnesses, etc., and he gets this guy, Quincy, what's his name? Josiah Quincy. He's his former classmate, and to be part of his council, along with Samson Blowers, who's this loyalist lawyer. Lived to be 100, by the way. That's a very odd fact. Anyways, they basically argued for days, cross-examining, because, you know, especially at that time too, different judicial system in some senses. I mean, it's a similar parliamentary kind of judicial system for the most part to today, but back then, you know, if one of those men was found guilty with intent to kill, they were all going to be hanged, every single one of them. So John Adams fights hard. He argues relentlessly because that's just John Adams. And he acquits basically all the men of the intent to kill. 2 of them are found guilty of manslaughter, but it's a much lesser charge. And they're all not going to die. And then John Adams, soon after, about several months later, is basically forced to leave Boston and move the family back to the farm in Quincy and Braintree. And it's things like this. When you hear stories like this about John Adams, and there's several of these stories, because that's just who John Adams is. You know, he's a smart man. He's a brilliant man. He's a good man. And I would argue, basically, if you just had to look at John Adams, excuse me, tacos, and how I would basically characterize who he is and just explain in one sum, you know, of who John Adams is, his legacy, everything. John Adams is fundamentally one of the most important patriots and one of the most important founding fathers we ever had, who was an absolute victim of relatively historical bias and historical inaccuracies. And unfortunately, you know, rightfully so, historically looked down upon, partially due to his personality and the rough realities of the situations that he was put in. I know that's a mouthful, but I guess what I'm trying to say is it's you have to understand a lot of the things in a lot of context. Like, he's not a perfect person and perfect individual, but he also did a lot of things for the revolution itself that, us outside of George Washington, I think he's probably the second most important figure in terms of all the things that he ends up doing to help basically save this war. And the truth is, the revolution isn't won by one person. If you had to put the people in a hierarchy of importance, obviously George Washington's number one. We'd still be eating fucking cookies, calling them biscuits, okay? My lord, that'd be horrifying. But anyways, John Adams is probably a distant but very, reasonably close second for the most part. He negotiates so many things with just the French alone. And his entire life and the entire time during the entire revolution is fascinating. And without him, it makes Washington's life a little more difficult. Far more difficult. We don't get treaties that are much more favorable to the Americans without him. Everything he does for, I guess you could say, in terms of being one of the greatest ambassadors in some aspects, or one of the first ambassadors, and, his capabilities of foreign influence. And he does so much that it's very difficult for me to just say in this one little lump sum without having to go. There's the whole point of these deep dives. I can't just do these things without explaining the entire life of the particular individual. He's also a victim of circumstance too. Like, to become the first vice president, it's difficult. Especially for him, because he's a very prideful person. At one point he didn't want to become the vice president because he thought it was less than. He valued character, authority, and stuff like that, and power in some instances, just like a lot of those people back then. And, but he still did his duty. He did it because it was Washington, and he just said, I'll do it for you, Washington. Even though at that point the relationship was a little bit strained, so it's a little bit complicated for them. You also have to understand, too, that he's following the first president. Washington's setting all these precedents and setting all these rules, et cetera, that how we should follow. And, what is Adams to do? Is he just going to keep doing what Washington is doing, or is he going to do his own thing? These are unprecedented times because Washington kept the peace, but Adams is going to keep the peace. He's the second president, and people don't think about that, people don't think it's a bit of a weirdness and changing of the powers for the most part. And I think people need to keep that in mind, that, he's the second one. He's not Washington. He's going to be looked down upon in relative comparison to Washington, regardless, The truth is if Jefferson had won the second presidency, the truth is I think that a lot of the same shit would happen with Adams. That happened with Adams would happen with Jefferson. Jefferson will only get one term, and, history might be different. That's the truth, and that's a lot of what ifs happen. History is funny like that, I think. It's opportunity, it's potential, and I always ask questions of could these people do these exact things, or if things were different, what if Madison gets bold and decides he wants to run for president, instead of Jefferson? Things happen, but to be the second and to follow the man like Washington is tough. I don't think anyone could have done it, and I think for the most part, I think Adams did as well as he probably could have, but it's debatable though. Adams is a good man. I think fundamentally and principally in a lot of the things that effectively helped create this nation, And I think there's maybe a handful that fundamentally pointed our country in the direction that we are pointed in. There's a whole bunch of people that do a whole bunch of different things. A lot of people don't give John Marshall a lot of credit, and he's probably the single most important Supreme Court justice we've ever had in this country's history. That would shape the direction of how this country would go. He's one of these founding fathers specifically who are in this group. Washington, Jefferson, even Benjamin Franklin to an extent. Madison, and I think Adams is one of the most important of all those people, in my personal view. Because without Adams, a lot of things don't happen, and without Adams, I don't know. We probably won't be drinking tea, or eating biscuits, or calling cookies biscuits. But I think a close second would be John Adams in that relative reality to Washington. That if not for him, we would still be drinking tea and calling cookies biscuits. So anyways, where do we begin with John Adams? Let's start off with his childhood. So John Adams is born in October 30th, 1735 in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a really long history. Along with Virginia, I could probably do just entire podcast, like another episode specifically on just Massachusetts, okay? Because it has a very long history, Magna Carta, all of that, and I can only do so much. Otherwise, this is going to be like a fucking 15-hour long episode, and y'all are probably miserable just hearing me speak. I'm just kidding. How do I explain Massachusetts, though? Massachusetts is very different from Virginia. Its economy is very different. Virginia, and for the most part, most of the southern colonies in particular were basically just agricultural farming colonies, tobacco, wheat, etc., etc., and Massachusetts dabbled in that a little bit for the most part, but most of their economy is structurally and fundamentally based in trade, mercantile, textiles. They did a lot of lumber, fishing, ports, and and they traded a lot of stuff from the other colonies for the most part. They would trade to the British, little things like that for the most part. I will say this though about Massachusetts, it should be noted that it's one of the first colonies that really was a leading leader, I guess. That sounds horrible, confusing. I need to go back to school for English. Leader in the abolishing slavery. Notably, by the way, through court cases, not through legislation. I think it's very interesting. It was this lawyer, Benjamin Kent, who was actually a friend of John Adams at the time. He actually led one of the first trials, the freedom of slavery. I think it was Slew v. Whipple, winning the suit and helping, basically setting the precedent, I guess you could say, for the freedom of a lot of these slaves and the abolition eventually through more court cases, and then eventually through legislation, just outright for the most part. Notably, what I want to say too, Adams never owned slaves. He's actually one of the few founding fathers, along with Hamilton, to never actually own a slave. His family and his life, it's very interesting. He's not wealthy, but he's also not, I guess, poor either. His family's well off. His father was a tax collector. He was known as a freeholder, meaning he actually owned land. He was a free man who owned land, did not rent. A lot of people rented land at that point in time. A lot of them were tenant farmers, but he actually owned land. Just by virtue of him owning land, he was much more of a well-off person for the most part. He's also a shoemaker, a cobbler, I guess you could say. And he would, during the main farming seasons, he would farm, and then then he would do a shoe business on the side. John Adams Sr. is a very interesting person. He's kind of like a rebel too. A lot of the things that, because I look at it this way, if you want to know John Quincy Adams and you want to know John Adams, start with the father. A lot of the values that he ended up instilling in John Adams, that John Adams would ironically instill into John Quincy Adams, it's a lot of the same thing. Discipline, etc., etc. Principles that, to do the right thing. I think the rebellious nature, though, was always going to be with John Adams. It's not so much with John Quincy Adams until John Quincy Adams actually gets a little bit older and becomes much more of a congressman. His mother, though, this is interesting. It's a lot with the other founding fathers too, and not just like Jefferson or Madison. All of them all of them outside of Washington. The relationships with their mother and a lot of like the mother's history, for instance, it's not really well known. His mother was Susan Boylan. Just her entire life is not particularly well known. What is known as her family was a little bit more prominent than, say, her father. But, she had, specifically, there's no writings of her. And for some reason, John Adams and a lot of other founding fathers really don't talk about their mothers too much for whatever reason. Some might say they had a difficult relationship, but, what is known is, at the very least, it's I guess, non-emotional, genuine care from his mother for the most part. Some people even said that she's possibly literate, but it's also probably not accurate to say because John Adams would always have some writings about her being happy that she read a lot of the things that John Adams would legislate, etc., etc. It's a complicated relationship, but if I had to guess specifically, I think she was just a good woman that just raised her son, although it's probably really clear that a lot of the influence of who John Adams was came from his father, for better or worse, whatever your personal opinion is of it. John Adams, though, was the oldest of 4 children. He was named after his father, and he had a very close relationship with his father, as I said before, and what he actually considered, a really blessed childhood with his siblings. He was also cousins with Samuel Adams, notably. A lot of his siblings aren't very well documented. The only one that I think was really well documented, and I can't pronounce this motherfucker's name, is Ethiu, Ethiu. I'm totally sorry. But he was a soldier during the Revolutionary War. He would die of dysentery. But he was generally pretty close with a lot of his childhood siblings, and go hunting with them all the time whenever he get an opportunity, if not helping his father on the farm and doing random deeds and learning and reading and all that. Schooling, though, was very interesting. He was a fantastic student, but a mischievous one is probably how I would put it. He was always thinking about other things. It's not like he didn't like reading. He loved reading everything that he can get his hands on. Political theories, philosophy, etc., etc., etc. The problem is that, schooling, and I think just being taught, and by, being taught to a teacher, I think, really just, it does not vibe with him for the most part, And there's some initial debate about his upbringing for the most part in terms of his schooling. Because most people would say he was homeschooled, but primarily probably by tutors, not by his family or parents specifically, and then he would actually go to school. But his school was not very. He was a very mischievous student, at least by what the actual teachers basically said. Because sometimes he'd always he'd always bring a gun to school, which I think is very interesting because how times have changed. But he always bring a gun to school because he's always thinking about going hunting after school to be with his friends and family and all that, and siblings. From an early age, his family wanted things to be different for him. His family had I'll put it to you this way. John Adams Sr. did not want to be a farmer, and he did not want his son to be a farmer. He wanted his son to do something, and to do something that was going to be beneficial for him. And one thing to be beneficial was to be a minister for the church and whatnot. You could be a lot of things if you're a minister, but above all else, especially for John Adams, who loves to read and whatnot, he could be a teacher. And I think his father probably put 2 and 2 together, at least in some way, shape, and form in that particular, and John Adams, he just didn't want to do that. John Adams Jr., he actually liked farming. He liked being in the country. He enjoyed the outdoors, his youthfulness, etc. When you're a young kid and a young adult, you don't think about like what young kid's gonna want to be into politics, for instance. He didn't think he was gonna be this in the future. You have to understand that. Think about John Adams as a kid. He's this young, kind of really independent rebel in a lot of aspects, and all he wants to, if he could choose, I think back then, he probably would have been maybe a militia soldier at that point in time, or he might have been a hunter, been a scavenger in some way, shape, or form. I think he wanted to just do a lot of those things. And his father didn't want him to do that. His father wanted him to be a good man and a great man, and someone that was of stature, of importance in some way, shape, or form. So one day, this story at the very least, John Adams tells his father he wants to be a farmer. He wants to do this and do that. And, John Adams, he's relegated to basically just being a farmer in some way, shape, or form at this point, because he doesn't like school. He doesn't particularly, he's not super interested in it as much as he really wished he would be for the most part. He wants to be a kid. So his father basically says, all right, if you want to be a farmer, then you have to work. You have to work as hard as possible. So his father actually works him hard, I think for a day. Some stories to go back and forth for a couple days. And after, I guess you could say, hard farm working from sun up to sundown, his father asks him, hey, you like this? And his son basically is just like, yeah, I like it well, father. He hated it, but him being a fucking OG rebel, gangster rebel, he's basically just like, I don't care. I'm going to prove you wrong regardless, because that's just how John Adams is, That being said, he did, I think, and partly probably because of that moment, and a whole bunch of other moments in his life where, you grow up and you start thinking differently, maybe when you're 13, 14, you probably grow out of maybe going hunting with your siblings, and you're thinking to yourself, what am I going to do with my life? Because especially you have to understand too, 13, 14, you're basically the equivalent of like an 18, 19-year-old at that point in time. Like most people went to college at 15. How times have changed. Anyways, John Adams is really thinking about his future. He's trying to figure out what he's going to do with the rest of his life. He has actually a lot of options. Maybe he could go down the path of his father, be a minister. Maybe he could join the militia, be a military man. He's really thinking about this, and this is when he actually really starts, taking school seriously. This is when he starts doing some preparatory schooling and starts actually thinking. I'm going to do something. I'm going to learn. I'm going to actually be something for myself and do something with my life. He wanted to be someone great. He someone who had a lot of status. He wanted to be somebody in some way, shape, or form. He wanted to be an important person. And you can argue this was because his father and parents didn't really pay attention to him. I don't think it's because of that. I just think his parents instilled something in him that made him want to achieve greatness. Whatever that is for the most part. Or maybe at the very least just self-confidence that, hey, I can do this. And I can really achieve a lot of things. I work hard and I can do this. And I think that's really, it's much different than, yeah. But for the most part, when John Adams gets an opportunity, he applies and gets a scholarship, actually, to Harvard, And you have to understand that, in order to get a scholarship, you had to have some status with you, and he had to use his mother's status. Unfortunately, his father was more of a self-made man, and basically, in order to get those means, to come from a prominent family like his mother's, he had to use his mother's name, etc., etc. Anyways, he gets a grant from Harvard, and effectively starts going to school at Harvard when he's 15 years old. So he's at Harvard, and he's awesome. He's excelling academically, although the academic records are not really there. It's interesting, because he ranked 15th in his class, but it wasn't based off academic. It was based off of social status and standards. I always found that a little bit fascinating. But effectively, he ends up becoming a really solid student. He's a fantastic orator, and a great debater, and a great speaker. So I look at a young John Adams, this great speaker with a solid moral foundation, a deeply opinionated John Adams that's a rebel in every single word that you can think of. And once he graduates Harvard, he's really still conflicted with effectively what he wants to do with his life in some way, shape, or form. His father and he would actually have a very religious family with religious values. And effectively he ends up deciding, you know what? I'm going to be a lawyer. Probably sees a bunch of people, sees a lot of lawyers making a lot of money, traveling around the country and the colony for the most part, handing out a bunch of cases. So he decides, I'm going to be a lawyer. So once he graduates from Harvard, he starts teaching school. And while teaching school, he studies under James Putnam, who was a prominent lawyer back then. Because back then, ironically, Harvard didn't teach law back then, or at least didn't prepare you for. There was no law schools back then, so if you're going to actually be a lawyer, and this would be for every other founding father who was a lawyer, you had to study under someone, and specifically, you had to work for them, and then get their books so that you could study them, and basically learn from them, so you can take the bar for your specific colony in order to actually, become a registered lawyer. And he did that. He did that for years, basically 4 years once he graduates, I believe around 1755. Excuse me, about 18, 19, and 20. And then he actually takes the bar exam and becomes a lawyer in 1759. So once Adams becomes the lawyer in 1759, you have to understand that this is, 1759, the French and Indian Wars and basically full swing. A lot of things are still happening. And rising anti-British sentiment is happening, and it's specifically happening starting really in Massachusetts. They're basically the beginnings of the revolution for the most part. So if you want to thank anyone for the revolution, you can thank the people of Massachusetts for the most part. At this point, Adams, he's not I guess you could say he's very anti-British, but not like vehemently so at this point in time. He sees a lot of things happening, both in the cities and then a lot of the other places in the countryside, of where the British are basically impeding a lot of the rights of particular citizens and individuals. And in particular, nothing really happens for him, at least for a couple of years, for the most part, as he basically tries to build up his practice, be this lawyer, taking cases farm by farm, eventually in the cities. Eventually, he would actually part of his job would take him up north. But anyways, John Adams is not part of this Revolutionary War cause yet. He doesn't really become it until he actually gets to see this lawyer named James Otis Jr. Case specifically. He's this well-respected lawyer, where Adams was able to actually see the arguments. It's known as the writs of assistance, I guess. The closest thing I guess you could say is a warrant, but it's not really technically accurate to say that it's a warrant. It's basically the specific thing that James Otis Jr. was basically trying to go against, which it gave the British leeway to tax, do whatever they want as liberally as they wanted to do, taxes. And that's actually where specifically the famous taxation without representation might have come from. There's a whole bunch of different sources that I've been looking up and trying to get the actual confirmation of it. But generally speaking, that's actually where the general, beginnings of that came from. And it's around this period of time that, he's not this part of this revolutionary movement, but he's very aware of it. And he starts getting his own ideas and his own interpretations of it. And Adams has a very complex view, I would say, of Britain, and I think of just the idea of what Britain was doing and whatnot. Because I think, and I'm basically just gonna go into it a little bit later. But to begin with it, his ideas probably at this point are, I don't like the British, but at the same time, with everything that's happening, for us to go to war, it's not really feasible, and it'd be foolish to do so. And at the very least, until something specific and big happens, we're gonna be their citizens for the most part. So anyways, he becomes a lawyer, and he starts doing a bunch of cases all around Massachusetts. And actually, he's taking everything that he can, and he's this really prominent, outspoken, brash, stubborn lawyer who ends up winning a lot of cases, and people like him, and people basically start flocking to him. He even actually has cases up in basically the area that would effectively be Maine yet. It wasn't a state back then. Helping people mainly with farming cases. And Boston specifically, as a lot of problems and conflicts are happening with people from Boston and the British. It's difficult too for him at times, because you have to understand, class is everything. Class is still a problem today. Let's just be honest with that. I don't want to get political, but for the most part, I don't think a lot of the racial things are actually racial. I think it's more of a class issue than anything else, because class even back then was still pertinent and important in even in this time and era. What I mean is, he's a farmer's lawyer, and a lot of people do not look, fondly on farmers and farmer lawyers for the most part. It was like a second-class kind of lawyer in a lot of instances, in a lot of ways. So when he moved to Boston, he was no longer this farmer's lawyer. He's something else, etc., etc. And it was very different back then. Even in Massachusetts, where there's still class, even though the more class-based stuff is probably happening in Virginia. Around this time too, Adams is kind of a bro. He's just dating, just chilling. You know what I'm saying? There's a couple girls he's courting at one time. I kid, obviously. He's not a player. He's a much more, good-mannered and good-natured man. He's basically just courting a couple girls, though, and he's deeply lonely, obviously, etc., etc. Yada yada yada. And there's a couple instances where he actually almost proposes, but the moment was lost. Man, but lame, I know. But on the bright side, things positively look out for him. So after some time, he's about 28 by the time he meets Abigail. Abigail, the future wife, essentially. Notably his third cousin, I might want to add. But effectively, they end up getting really acquainted with each other. Really, they meet, and it's kind of just, when you meet someone, it's kind of just, damn, I don't know what it is about you. I just want to get to know you. It's kind of like one of those particular instances. I think she was 19 or something at the point. There's about a decade or so difference in their ages, or about 8, not a decade, but it's a prominent gap, I would probably say. I don't have their actual specific ages, but effectively, they're taken by each other specifically. And, it's also debatable about how the families felt about each other. Some stories say that her mother was so happy that she was marrying John, but at the same time, she's also really disheartened because he's a farmer's lawyer, class, etc., etc. Anyways, the two get married. And I'll just briefly explain their marriage because, at least in relative comparison to, say, Washington, their marriage was something quite beautiful. Really, really beautiful. How do I explain it? It's one of the true, unique, great love stories of all time. And I think a lot of presidents have a lot of great love stories. But for him and John, or her and John, it's specifically really, really beautiful. Because most of it, especially nowadays, it might just be more historically because you have to understand, at one point in time, they didn't really see each other for 12, 13 years, from the beginning of the war to him basically being a part of the foreign ambassador of Britain and basically being in Europe the entire time. There was a lot of periods where they did not see each other for a bulk of their lives. So they would basically just write each other all the time, and just shows the actual beauty and nature of their relationship. A lot of the correspondence, being very positive and loving, and she was basically like his closest advisor and confidant. A lot of people say Abigail's probably the first genuine feminist kind of person, because she's basically like, hey, can we get the right to vote here, kind of thing. And whatever any guy's opinion, I actually think it's pretty kind of badass in a lot of ways. She's not crazy. She's kind of just like, hey man, I'll do my job, I'm gonna do my wifely duty and yada yada, but if we're gonna be doing this, it's gonna be a partnership. It's gonna be something beautiful and brilliant, and we're gonna work at this together. And I respect the hell out of her for that. And John Adams loved this woman to death. She was his rock for every, when she dies, it's a very dark period for John for a little bit, because he ends up living for a long time. But anyways, it's a beautiful relationship and a beautiful marriage. And the two would have 6 kids together, 4 of them that would live into adulthood. Again, notably, John Quincy Adams, It's never perfect, obviously. Every single marriage has their problems, and everyone's going to have their differences, and everyone's going to have their problems, and especially for a long period of time that they're away, it would, be difficult. But if you want to talk about actual great love stories and great marriages and partnerships and all this is probably one of the absolute strongest. And out of every single one of the presidents, it's probably easily top 3 in my personal view. So when they get married, it's roughly around 1765, for instance. The Stamp Act. This is basically a period in time where the rising influence of Britain, for the most part, is being strangleholded on the colonies, and specifically Massachusetts, because it's the most rambunctious of the bunch for the most part. And they need their war debts paid off and a whole bunch of other things. And, they need to take hold of the colonies before they, get a little bit too extra, and before they get too, I guess you could say, thinking in liberty and freedom and all that, etc., etc. It's a very important time, because John Adams' feelings on the British and, the idea of a revolution is really changing too. He becomes someone that's actually thinking about, what works. And as a government, I guess, in some way, shape, or form. He starts thinking things out, and he starts thinking, what could work? And, at this point, John Locke, a lot of Lockean philosophy, Adam Smith, everything that's going to be starts coming within the next 15, 20 years, obviously, with economics and whatnot. But, he's thinking for himself, and he's thinking what can actually work. And in thinking of what works, he starts looking into the actual philosophical approach, just like a lot of the other founding fathers and a lot of the other particular individuals there. He's influenced by Greek philosophy. And he comes up and thinks about a republic and republicanism. And he starts actually writing out his ideas in a lot of ways, and in essays that he would basically disseminate into newspapers that a lot of people would read all across Massachusetts, and under the pseudonym of Humphrey Plowjogger, which, you know what, I'm not that creative to come up with a name like that, so I kind of have respect for the man. God damn, I love this man. He was an avid fundamental believer in a republic, the Enlightenment figure, and into, deep political philosophy. And for those of you who don't know or don't functionally understand, the democracy basically is what the Greeks were under, and for the most part it was actually really good. The problem is functionally speaking, majority rules, or at least that's one of the consequences of it. And a democracy can work if everyone is functionally and fully informed, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is that it goes against human nature in some ways and aspects, because no one's going to be fully informed, and there are going to be people that are going to try and take advantage of this whole majority rules aspects. And Adams did not like that. He did not like a democracy. He was basically such an avid believer that democracy was going to be really bad. If 51% of the population was basically like, let's all jump off a bridge with no parachutes, against the will of the other 49%, there's going to be some problems. But the idea of a republic, and specifically in some ways in the early ideas of what a constitutional republic would be, was that Republican rule is liberty, freedom, inalienable rights, specific things that you cannot do, that you cannot basically force people into do it if it is legally protected in some way, shape, or form. I'm not saying he wrote inalienable rights, because I think that was much more of a Jefferson kind of thing. But at the very least, the influence of that came when they were all writing the Declaration of Independence. Anyways, sovereignty of the man is what Adams is thinking fundamentally. This requires people that everyone do their duty, that no one basically violates. It's basically America. The very fundamental foundations that he's pushing. This uncompromising commitment to liberty, pushing and rooting out the corruption as much as humanly possible for as much as possible. And his ideas functionally and basically are, for a republic, is that we are all going to be as educated as we possibly can be, and that these are the specific rules. That these are the specific things that no one can violate. And if you want to do this democracy rule thing, that's fine. But if it violates any one of these things, no bueno. It's not going to happen. It's a really, really big idea of it. And, he starts this little movement thing, these essays. They don't reach the most amount of prominence, but people read them, and it starts, getting people a little bit curious about what liberty really is. I think it's deeply fascinating. Adams especially and specifically defines it in his particular and own words, that a republic, like specifically, is a government that all men, regardless of class, are equally subject to the law. Which, again, I want to point out, Adams did not own slaves. I just want to point that out. So around this time, there's rising tensions, and I say the war was over, British needed to recoup their finances, so they begin levying taxes to people. All these taxes, especially in Massachusetts, where they are not happy with these taxes. The Stamp Act, etc., etc., especially the Stamp Act. There was widespread opposition. Actually, Adams was on the forefront of this. He was not happy with this. He specifically went to federal courts to an extent to have the tax removed, and not specifically him, actually, but people specifically had them go to the federal courts to actually, hey, this is not legally right, et cetera, et cetera. And, people had to pay their taxes. So then people in Massachusetts, and this is more about the revolution now that I'm talking about than actual John Adams that I'm trying to explain. People were basically getting mad. This patriot rebel movement was rising. People were using the newspapers as propagandas, and like they would kind of just do little things against the British, trip them up a little bit, push them around, throw snowballs at them, basically using a lot of, I'll put it to you this way, when people are basically saying, hey, you can't come and stay at our house, you can't quarter in this place, John Adams is basically like, well, if there's going to be a legal argument, then I'm going to be there and make some money. So he's a very busy man at this particular point in time. So John Adams is really profiting off of this. And I think it's really deeply fascinating that Massachusetts is the one state to actually really begin all this. There's opposition in other states, obviously, Virginia especially too, even parts of Carolinas, although there's far more loyalists down there than, at least at that point in time. Although there were a lot of people that were very opinionated, liberty-minded individuals, specifically around like where Andrew Jackson was for the most part too. But for the most part in Massachusetts especially, rising anti-British sentiment. And so you have to understand too, because the main reason partially too was because it was trade. They were going to partially have some of their taxes or have their goods taxed regardless. Yeah, some form of tariffs back then, along with the actual stamp tax themselves. So it's like I'm paying 1%, and then I'm paying another percent just for the actual stamp tax too. It's dumb. It's ridiculous, and a lot of their economies were really built on like trade. You need to stamp shit for the most part. It's not the same, say, in the South, for instance. So I'm just gonna sell you these bundles of tobacco, although it was similar in that vein if you're gonna be trading that tobacco. But most of them, the farmers down there, from a trade wheat, it's going to be going straight up north to help supply and feed people and whatnot, et cetera, et cetera. Little things you have to think about and little things you have to really understand and why a lot of these things were important. It's not just because they're being taxed. It's just because they're being taxed on their livelihood to a point where it could hurt them. It could cripple them. And it's not like every single merchant up there was rich. They weren't. Some were poor and some were getting by, I think actually surprisingly the Washington show turned in the first couple episodes especially. They show how trade, mercantile stuff kind of works a little bit. It's not easy. It's very, very much not easy. A lot of people were poor and it was really difficult for them. So you have to understand that. You have to understand what's happening there. So anyways, Adams he's getting a lot of work. He's getting a lot of opportunity. A lot of people are requiring his work in Boston. So he decides, hey, you know what? Let's just do it. Let's make the jump. Okay, I'm farming, I'm part-time, not being able to really do much work there, so screw it. Let's just go back. Let's just go to Boston. So he uproots his entire family, his growing family at that point. And at this point, he's making most of his money being a lawyer, so I'm going to support my family. I'm going to do it in this particular way, shape, and form. So in 1768, he officially moves his practice to Boston. It's a rough start, People look down on him a little bit, like, this country guy is moving in. Okay, well, whatever. But, he starts building up his name. A lot of people like him. He wins a lot of cases, and people start like, okay. And not to mention, too, he just wanted to prove people wrong. He just has that personality where he just wants to overcome. He's just going to prove, hey, I'm not this particular individual. I'm going to be doing, et cetera, et cetera. That's partially the reason why, like, he grew up in this, like, I'm not a farmer's kid, I'm just a person, so, I'm going to prove you wrong that I'm not just a simple-minded lawyer. But, again, not the simple-minded lawyer, but effectively, he just wanted to make a life for his family. And I would probably say at this point, his idea of what, he was anti-British, but he was neutral in most things, because, you have to understand, if you're being a patriot or being a loyalist, like, most people didn't really want to take sides, because either way you're going to probably be persecuted in some way, shape, or form, whether by the British if you're a patriot or if you're, a loyalist by the actual patriots themselves. It's a difficult time. So he tried to stay neutral, take care of his family and stuff. He did have anti-British sentiments. Let's make that very clear. He didn't like the British, and I think if things really escalated at that particular point, he'd probably be one of the many people leading the charge against the British. But basically, he ends up just being a normal lawyer for the most part, helping people figure out their counsel. He sees all this happening. He sees all the atrocities and the egregious persecution of people and the I guess you could say violations of human rights, these unalienable rights and whatnot. But he's not liking what he's seeing. That being said, he's just trying to live his life for the most part, and it actually becomes much more on the forefront of everything once he becomes the actual lawyer of the Boston Massacre, the British soldiers of that. That particular case actually kind of puts him in the limelight, for better or worse, where he would eventually become part of the legislature and whatnot. But that case in particular, where he acquits the 6 soldiers, and basically saves the other two who were basically accused or found guilty of manslaughter. Sorry, my brain's not working right now. It changes the very direction of where he's going to be going, both politically, everything. Because at that point, he ends up just saying, you know what, screw it. I've done this, etc., etc. These people deserve. He takes a stand. It's very. You have to understand that's a big moment for him specifically, both in just like I'm going to do this because I'm going to do this the right thing. I'm also going to probably move out. It's very bold because I'm probably going to be persecuted by patriots now at this point. And also, like, I'm just going to make it very clear that if I take this case, I'm in it. I'm in this revolution game. I'm going to be in it for the next 50, 40, or 40 plus years of my life. And this is a very big moment for him when he actually does, or 30 years realistically, of my life. This is going to consume it. And I think this is like that big kind of like moment, I would say, like the crossroads moment for him, because I wonder what happens if he doesn't take this case or... Excuse me. I think, or someone else takes it, or the soldiers just all get guilty and they die. Like, I don't know what happens because the soldiers being acquitted really damaged his reputation in some way, shape, or form to the patriot cause. Although a lot of people found it brave and found it really just and principled, and a lot of patriot, and Sam even had some kind words to say, even though he was an ardent patriot. But for the most part, at this point, he actually eventually does become the leading voice in Massachusetts, and this is a big moment for him to become that leading choice, And I think, in fairness too, in this particular case, the way he saw the British was more like, he thought that they were doing wrong, but they were misguided specifically in what they were doing, in terms of like a lot of things, because he didn't like the British. But I think he tried to be empathetic and understand, their perspective and point of view around this particular time. After the trials, he effectively, later, but generally, leaves Boston in 1771 due to the revolutionary fervor and, the potential to get hurt and whatnot from the Patriots and British alike, actually, I would probably say. He just wanted to get away from it all, protect his family, so he moves back to the farm in Braintree and effectively tries to become both a farmer and a lawyer. And he works, in a lot of the courts, and eventually speaking, he would be part of the state legislature, but he effectively basically becomes a lawyer that basically tries to fuck with judges in some way, shape, or form with a lot of the cases that he's doing for the most part. He becomes like a real civil rights activist, in I guess in some ways, during this period in time. He ends up effectively being eventually a leading voice, It's during this period of time before, I would say, the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre. He becomes a real big voice. He basically just saying, hey, you know what? I may have helped these people, but a lot of the shit that's happening, y'all gotta stop this. Y'all gotta stop this, okay? He's very blunt about it too, so that's why I'm saying y'all gotta stop this shit, okay? But effectively, he becomes a supporter of the actual colonial cause. He starts becoming a fervent revolutionary in particular. When he sees the British bribing a lot of people to have, certain court cases go their particular way. He actually takes out an ad in a newspaper, I think, or basically disseminates in the newspaper, which riles a lot of people up. That particular moment really pushes him to be a revolutionary patriot. I don't want to say, like, let's just be an independence revolutionary patriot, but for sure this puts him functionally within the cause. Damn tacos. Absolutely, and really makes him one of the leaders in Massachusetts, especially at that point in time. So by the time 1773 happens, the Tea Party occurs, the Boston Tea Party, which it'll be a much shorter episode, but if I'm going to do, I think that specifically deserves it's its own entire little segment in history, because that moment in particular, I think, is a very important moment, because I don't think you understand how important that particular moment is. So I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of them basically dumping out, I think, what in today's money is probably close to like $1.2 million worth of tea in protest against the British. You have to understand too, like, the tea itself, it's not like tea bags. Tea bags weren't really, I don't think they were even invented back then. They was like little bricks for the most part, like little big chalk bricks that look like, Hershey's chocolate bars. When you take a little piece and you just dip it in there until the actual tea itself changes. And like when you throw $1 million worth of tea, like tea that could actually last you like a year or two. Like that's fucking insane to me. Little things like that. But Adams becomes such a big supporter, also because, his cousin's part of it. He ends up becoming the counsel, supports him if anything occurs for the most part in terms of litigation. So, this is a very crazy time. Things are escalating beyond all belief and recognition once this Tea Party movement happens. This is why it's such a big moment, is because that particular act escalates everything, Because I remember it's 3 years after the Boston Massacre, but then 3 years after this, the Tea Party war, the Declaration of Independence, like, it's kind of like, when people think of like, Harambe caused all this bullshit that's happened, like the Boston Tea Party caused America to exist, like I tend to think of it in that particular same light and same vein, and I think it's funny. So, due to the rising tensions in Adams becoming such an outspoken supporter for independence and being a leader in Massachusetts especially, Adams effectively agrees with everyone, a lot of people, and the main people in charge of Massachusetts, that something needs to happen. So they effectively call on the other 13 colonies to join in what would effectively be the first Continental Congress. Except Georgia. They're chilling. They don't want to have anything to do with this. They're cool with everything that's happening for the most part, and they're basically just okay for the most. They don't want any conflict whatsoever, which is fair in their aspect and point of view. Adams doesn't really want to go to this for the most part. He has to be coaxed by Samuel Adams' cousin. It's a very weird relationship with them. I wouldn't say they're particularly close. They were only really close because of the actual Revolutionary War cause. But I don't know if they're basically going to be going out for drinks, every other weekend. There's a bit of an age gap too between the two of them. But he's very persistent. He's basically like, John, you gotta join this, man. You gotta come, okay? You gotta do this. So John effectively does join the Continental Congress, and he starts meeting a lot of the other people and the other independence-minded individuals. Because at this point, and I gotta be honest, at this point, fundamentally, with everything that's happening and seeing war himself as an inevitability, is a full favor advocate of independence and an advocate of revolution at the First Continental Congress. And he attempts to unite a lot of these people to this specific common cause. He doesn't really want to say it out loud specifically because, the idea of independence is kind of just like, ugh, like that's like, because at that point, most of the people basically just want to fix their relationship with Britain. They just want to just not tax us, Can we just come back to antebellum in some way? Can we just like go back to normal? And but Adams secretly is basically like, dude, we gotta just fucking cut ties. Cut this motherfucker off, you know what I'm saying? And he's really working in secret in some way, shape, or form. Because at the First Continental Congress, although it's in his heart for independence, and, because you understand, like, there's potential for him, like, this republic to happen, this new government to happen, where people can actually do their own thing, and they can actually bring something new to the table other than this. We can create our own nation. We can do this. He's one of the very first early people to think about this, which is why he becomes such a big advocate in the Second Continental Congress. But he's secretly right now just working, at least exteriorly, in the First Continental Congress while trying to, lead them down that direction. He doesn't want to let people know that he's secretly for independence. He's like, okay, we're with British and stuff like that. But if it happens that we need to do independence, we gotta cut it off immediately, So he's showing off, hey, I'm still with the British, but if it happens, we're gonna do this. That's at the very least how I perceive, fundamentally him being that person in the First Continental Congress. So after the First Continental Congress and they do their embargo on the British goods, things escalate. There's more people in Massachusetts. Things keep escalating and escalating. They're getting more serious in their taxes, and they're getting more serious in their conduct, and they're really laying the ground, just dominating. The British are specifically, and trying to stranglehold the colonists to do their bidding for the most part. And the colonists, they're not having it. Things like the Patriots, they're basically the Sons of Liberty. Sorry, my man, the Sons of Liberty are basically just pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and they're fighting back. Basically, little skirmishes in it every now and then, but for the most, not a lot of little skirmishes. They're doing more political kind of behind the back stuff. They're getting ready. They're getting arms ready. They're getting munitions ready. In fact, the whole point of Lexington and Concord, I believe, everything that happened, Paul Revere's ride, they're actually trying to capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams because they had a whole bunch of munitions and whatnot. And I might be getting Bunker Hill mixed up too. But basically, a lot of this was munitions. They were preparing, and the British were trying to sneak it out for the most part. And that's when the war really starts, is with Lexington and Concord, the first shot heard around the world. So by the time that happens and the Second Continental Congress is called, you want to talk about someone who's like banging the drum on patriotism, what America is, independence, revolution, let's do this, and it's John Adams. Not everyone's still apprehensive, but he's coming in full guns a-blazing. He's like, we're going to war, and we're going to fucking win this shit. And John Adams, he's just basically this ardent patriot. He met and worked, and let me point this out too. He meets a lot of important people too that he probably hadn't met before. He met Washington and Franklin, the First Continental Congress. He respects both of them very well. But then in the Second Continental Congress, he meets Thomas Jefferson, who was a rising star within the Virginia legislature and ends up getting the opportunity to be a part of the Second Continental Congress. Excuse me. So anyways, the two meet, and they end up becoming incredibly fast and good friends. They both really enjoy each other. They're both intelligent, and Thomas Jefferson, I don't think is really an original thinker, at the very least conceptually, but I think he takes a lot of ideas and really makes them his own in his own particular. I think Adams is much more of an independent-minded thinker and things, and he's much more of a creative individual in that particular aspect. And I think they both really went back and forth on it. And I think those two were really good fit together in terms of just... I can just imagine their conversations. John Adams gives this really abstract idea, and Jefferson will probably form it into something that's concise and brilliant. And that's how the Declaration of Independence effectively was made. Written for the most part. Before we get to that, though... By the Second Continental Congress, John Adams is basically banging the drum for independence. We're doing this. It's going to happen. A lot of people, he starts getting people on his side, and if it wasn't for him just banging the drum, they wouldn't be preparing for war for the most part. So then Congress basically is like, okay, we'll create this army, and we're trying to figure out who leads it. And John Adams is like, George Washington, and he ends up really being the guiding force for George Washington, which is interesting because he actually used to be counsel for John Hancock, who was another potential option. But, politics again, just really shapes how this country and the direction this country would effectively go. And with George Washington effectively being the guy. But I think it wasn't really politics. I think it was more he just thought George Washington was the guy. Oh, okay, partly because also Virginia, to get them into the war, the largest colony, was really important and really grand, and the one thing that was really going to help them, for the most part, succeed and win the war. So around this particular point in time, during all of the Second Continental Congress, they're arguing and debating about what to do, Because you understand, it's not like the moment he banged the drum, it was going to be for independence. No, it was effectively just a lot of talking about, are we going to repair our relationship with Britain, or are we going to succeed finally and become our own nation? And it was really mixed, because a lot of people were trying to figure out, how is this going to work? Because you understand the idea of independence. It's grand an idea, and it seems like simple to us nowadays, but back then, there was nothing like this to really occur. Obviously there were revolutions and whatnot, but colonies this large, this landmass this large, and there's people this potentially strong and capable. We can be self-sufficient, but how do we do this? What do we do in order to actually make something of this? A lot of people were afraid, and in fact, a lot of people that were loyalists just wanted to go back to basically being colonies of to Great Britain, and I understand that. It's kind of scary. I'd rather pay 2% tax than, have to fight a very bloody, violent, and chaotic war for the next 6 to 8 years. And, it's going to be a lot of hardship. And it just seems simpler that way. And the future's so unknown, And then you have a lot of people who are this independence-minded people. Patrick Henry, John Adams, all these people. And John Adams is that voice who's basically saying, this has to happen. There's no turning back at this point, to be honest, in fairness. He's a pretty pragmatic individual, I would say. He's just like blunt and honest. Like, this is it. Once we go back, if we attempt to go back, it's just not going to be the way that it was before. Everything's changed at this point. So, after a lot of deliberation, etc., and people trying to figure out what to do, Thomas Paine, he releases this little pamphlet called Common Sense, which is the biggest advocate for, independence that gets disseminated all across the colonies. And that ends up being, in some ways, one like the actual straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing for the colonists to basically just say, you know what, let's do it. So then they asked John Adams, the Committee of Five, I think, or there's a couple people, but the primary people in this committee would be Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, along with them, to create the Declaration of Independence, the document that's going to sever the ties between Great Britain and the colonies. So he creates this committee, and they first start talking it out for the most part, a little bit, and effectively he ends up just saying, you know what, Jefferson, I think you got to write it. And then Jefferson's really confused, and he's like, well, why? And then Adams is like, motherfucker, okay, like I'm just kidding. Now he's basically like, look, you're Virginian, okay, the more we can get Virginians into the cause, the more we're going to have much more support, much more capabilities. And number two, you're just a motherfucking better writer than me, man, okay, you just write better. That's just how it goes. You're Thomas fucking Jefferson, Obviously that's not what happened, but I'm just having fun here. Anyways, they basically start this. You have to understand too, when I say the importance of John Adams, he has so much influence in a lot of things that we don't think of. And after reading the McCullough book on John Adams, I basically am left to think that most of the actual contents of the Declaration of Independence, I would probably say, are John Adams. Well, in fairness, Jefferson, like 60-40 John Adams, 40% Jefferson. Most of the unalienable rights, the idea of this republic that they're trying to create, like it's everything. All men are created equal. I'm not saying Jefferson didn't believe in it; he absolutely did. And that's actually why they got along very well. But I think most of the ideas that, like I said before, John Adams was this free-thinking individual. Excuse me. And Thomas Jefferson was a hyper-intelligent man that can actually focus a lot of the things that John Adams would probably write abstractly. And I think both those two working together and Franklin helping to edit it is such a big moment and a great combo. And ultimately, after writing and editing, after like weeks of trying to get this thing done, they bring it to Congress. And again, more arguments ensue. People don't want this. People want to go back. They want to be, not loyalists, but they just want the relationship to be normal again. And John Adams, because Thomas Jefferson did not like to debate people. He did not like to argue and all that stuff. This is a big reason why he ended up leaving after arguing with Alexander Hamilton. He would get headaches from it. But John Adams in particular is just, he's the one arguing for this. He's fighting for it. He wants this ratified because you know what? There is no going back. There is no going back. We are our own people. We are Americans. We are not British. We're like 5 generations removed from that at this point. And after a lot of arguing, a lot of debating, and after the vote, they decide to ratify the Declaration of Independence, which a lot of people like to point out is funny because John Adams once said the greatest day in American history is going to be July 2nd, but it wasn't fully ratified until 2 days later on America's birthday, July 4th, 1776. So I'm going to speed it up a little bit because there's a lot to cover with John Adams, and I don't want this to be like a 4-hour-long episode. But I will try and be as detailed as possible within the relative time constraints for the most part. So just explain what happens during John Adams during the point after the Declaration of Independence, and basically the end of the war. A lot of things. First and foremost, I guess in a lot of ways you can consider him technically the first real Secretary of War in a lot of aspects, in a lot of ways. He's effectively, after the Declaration of Independence, he basically becomes the person that helps see the initial supply chain for the troops and the civilians. He starts trying to raise money. He's trying to work long hours. He's corresponding with George Washington during a lot of this time, trying to get everything that he can do to help I don't know, Washington and the colonial soldiers. He's also really fighting for the colonial people, or the colonists at the time, and then the Continental Congress to get the French involved. He's a big advocate for that. I understand this too. During this time, during the Continental Congresses, and now his time working for the federal government, he's not seen his family in a long time. This would be a real big point in terms of effectively the kind of like relationship he would have with his kids in the future, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's really important just to understand that like he's giving up a lot, and really wears on him. Imagine him working like 16, 18 hours days, it seems like, for the most part, just trying to get people organized, trying to get people to do things. It's chaos a little bit at times in certain places, especially. It's like, hey, can this city and town know it's under British control? Okay, cool. How about this? Just imagine just trying to procure anything that you could possibly procure and getting it to Washington, and who's going to pay for it? And you're just trying to print money. You're trying to figure things out, and it's really difficult, and it's pretty much overwhelming. And John Adams did suffer bouts of depression too, so you have to understand that, and like real depression, I would probably say. So for him, it's a lot, and ironically too, at this time he's writing a book. He's wrote this pamphlet, I guess you could. It depends. I think it's a book, but he writes his book, and it's called basically Thoughts on Government, which basically is one of the most influential books, the low-key influential books of all time, because it's the book where a lot of the actual state constitutions all across this country were actually founded upon, for the most part. It wasn't like this insane book, but I would argue it actually has probably influenced James Madison the most, at the very least. It didn't have everything, for the most part, but it did have, at the very least, 2 legislative bodies and a judicial system, and et cetera, and all that. And it's a really big basis for a lot of the state constitutions, including the Massachusetts Constitution that he would eventually end up helping create years later. So, effectively, during this time, he's trying to make the war effort much more possible for a lot of the people there during this time, and for Washington, And, let me see. Create their own constitution. So I'm reading off my little outline list, and I lost track of it. The initial battles and skirmishes go poorly, I guess you could say. At one point, after the loss in New York for Washington, I believe it was Adams and Franklin. Adams and Franklin have a really good relationship. It's more like I think I would probably consider the relationship a little bit like a sitcom. There's actually a story about them when they're traveling, because they actually basically go negotiate with General Howe up in New York for maybe some sort of peace, and somewhat to maybe try and go back. Although Adams is not really adamant for peace, because there's no going back. But effectively, there's a story about them, and they have a because Franklin's like a bit of a hippie, and Adams is like a very stern. I guess you could consider him like a colonial version of like a old school religious conservative person. He's just like straightforward in a lot of ways, and I would consider the relationship, especially when they're in France, kind of like a sitcom. But anyways, he goes there, and once he tries to ratify some sort of peace, and it fails miserably because Adams doesn't want peace and Howe doesn't want peace. Adams kind of becomes a bit of a target a little bit. At least for the British, it would lead through, some trouble with his family, as he's trying to worry about his family for the most part, especially in that particular area. And I think it's interesting too, because his son John Quincy Adams and his wife actually saw the Battle of Bunker Hill. Now, when John Quincy Adams was a little lad. So effectively around this time too, he does a lot. That's basically it. He's trying to do everything he can just to keep his country afloat, He does this for years, and after basically a year and a half of just doing this ever since the ratification of the Declaration of Independence, he decides, I have to take a break. So then he goes back home to Massachusetts. And then when he goes back home, he tries to enjoy some semblance of peace with his family while the war is raging on. And then he gets called back by the Continental Congress, and they're basically saying, hey, we need you in France. So he's like, fuck. So then he basically says, love, hey, Abigail, I'm going to take John Quincy with me. We're going to go to France. And, I'll get way more in depth with John Quincy Adams, because he is a deeply fascinating person. And I can't if I do, this is going to be a long episode. Effectively speaking, though, they decided to take John Quincy Adams at the very least for purposes of his education and his future, for the most part. And he's the oldest out of the other two siblings he would have, because I think John Quincy's about 11 years old, and the other two sons, Charles and I forget the other name, but like 5 or 6 at that point. So they take him, or he takes him off into France to negotiate the French, who are now much more accepting of maybe assisting within the actual war effort itself. And that boat ride is kind of an interesting story itself, where it's a really rough ride. There's some problems, some potential people might storm the ship and whatnot, thunderstorms as well. Like John Adams at the point, he like gets a gun, he's like, I'm ready to fight, and then the guy's like, chill, okay, I'll negotiate this, you stay under. A little tidbit too, he learns French on the way there. Then again, you're probably traveling by ship for a month and a half or so you might as well do something. But he learns French, and and his son learns French too, but learns French more fluently in France. But he travels to France, and he rejoins Benjamin Franklin to negotiate, if the French join the war. And you have to understand that, like, Ben Franklin didn't really do much there. He had a different negotiating style. He's much more like, I'm going to basically be the best friend of this particular person, and then we'll party together, and then we'll get them into the actual war effort itself. And in some ways it could work, but it was taking too long. And Ben Franklin, he really enjoyed the lifestyle there, a lot of the French ladies, etc., etc. And John Adams got there, and he's like, bro, what the fuck, man? Like, can you all just do your work? And Benjamin Franklin's probably just like, bro, can you just like relax and not be a stress ball for more than 5 seconds? And John, like I said, a bit of a sitcom. They had their disagreements, but once he got there, he really actively pushed for the French to join the war effort. The French thought he was really fucking annoying. His personality, he's this brash, stubborn person, and they basically just said, dude, just chill. And he's like, fuck it, I don't care anymore. And it took a lot of time, but you know what? After he left, he was instrumental in not only them joining the war effort, but specifically to get their Navy involved, and specifically to help their Navy basically effectively win the war, especially when they joined in the siege of Yorktown. So after that, it's about 1779, he basically comes back. He comes back with Quincy. And he comes back home, and it's a little bit tricky too, but once he gets home specifically, he tries to relax and rest, but he can't, because you want to know why? Massachusetts, at this particular point, to continue their aggressive push for, independence, because they're basically just like, we're doing this, it's happening, we don't care what the British are, what they say, etc., etc. They decided to create their own state constitution. They asked John Adams, who wrote this book, to basically be one of the people who's going to help assist in this. So then, effectively, he comes back and he creates the Massachusetts State's Constitution during the war to separate the British ideals from the colonists. And you have to understand, this is still the oldest constitution in the world, I believe. I'm not 100% positive. This is more of a Google thing I just looked up out of curiosity. And I mean, if I'm correct, it's still technically the oldest constitution within the world itself today. You have to understand the United States Constitution would be until 1789. So basically, he comes back home and he's relaxing, and he sees something that's very, very, very scary. That's America's finances, because once he left, there wasn't really anything that they could do. They just kept printing money for the most part, and the inflation rate was so bad. I think at this point it's about 25 to 30 times the actual rate for the continental dollar. Made it even more difficult too, that every single colony had their own form of currency. So it is beyond scary. So John Adams really he tries to get the French involved initially, sending letters, hey, we got to do something, and then he just says screw it. He goes back to Europe, with Quincy, and he tries to go to several different places in order to recuperate some sort of finance. And he specifically, I think he and Quincy and his assistant, John Adams' assistant, goes to Russia, or they go to the Russian countries and a whole bunch of all those other places in order to get some assistance. And John Adams specifically goes to the Dutch Republic, the Netherlands area. And basically there, he's just trying to take out loans. He's trying to talk to the Dutch people, and they're not really, interested in getting involved, especially with Great Britain being the superpower that they are. And he does get some help, he does get some charity, he does get some at least support and some people on their side, but for the most part he spends the next 2 years or so trying to raise money for the war and trying to raise money to help facilitate, some peace and try to keep this war going, keep America and George Washington alive. Note, too, that at one point I will admit that John Adams did have waver in some support, especially during the initial war effort when he was the Secretary of War. But I will point out that's much more of just, he's probably stressed. He's probably thinking, I'm doing all this and Washington's losing. What's the point, And he wavered. There's no doubt about it. But I don't think it was, like, the worst, okay. I think it was much more of a political thing if he was thinking about it, but I don't believe he thought Washington was going to fail in that endeavor. He stopped believing in George Washington. So once he's trying to get these loans, which, by the way, his house, I believe, becomes the actual first embassy, technically, which was in the Dutch Republic. In 1782, he basically gets word that the British, they're surrendering for the most part. They're giving up, and they want people. They want a treaty now. They're gonna work it out for the most part, and that they've been trying to work out a treaty for the last a while. So they've decided to ask John Adams, one of their big guns, to go over there and do this treaty, which would be the Treaty of Paris for the most part. So he basically goes over to Paris, and and I'll put it to you this way, the entirety of the Treaty of Paris, I don't know if it deserves its own episode specifically, but it's a very fascinating point because, there's a lot of things, it's kind of political in a lot of ways too, because a lot of people were trying to get in on this negotiations within the Treaty of Paris, and a lot of people were trying to go back and forth. The French were trying to get involved too because they wanted to get their own particular influence in there, maybe some things for them for the most part. And John Adams is basically just like throwing a fucking wrench, into a fucking airplane turbine, and and he just basically just goes in there once he arrives, and he's basically fighting tooth and nail for a lot of things. They actually try to kick him out at one point and successfully do so for some of the meetings. Although a lot of things that he wants effectively ends up becoming the things that affect. Basically, I'll put it to you this way. He argues and he fights tooth and nail. It becomes so annoying that they basically just say, you know what, let's just give John Adams what he wants and just do it. And they all technically agree. It's obviously not that. But, him just arguing in general gives a lot of concessions that are very favorable to the United States, at least in terms of mercantile and trade and whatnot. And I mean, it's difficult because, both parties will not do what they're supposed to do. America and Britain during the Treaty of Paris, that would actually lead to the War of 1812 eventually. But for the most part, at the very least, if they followed this plan, it was very favorable to both people, and especially America, specifically. And he clashed with Ben Franklin, too, especially. And, again, it's just like a sitcom, man. It's very fascinating. It's very interesting. But effectively, after the Treaty of Paris is signed, the war is over. The revolution's won, and America is America. And, at this point, John Adams is kind of enjoying the life. John Quincy Adams is going to school, doing a whole bunch of different things there. And John Adams is now trying to go home. It's late 1783. He's trying to make preparations, and then he gets word, hey, can you go to Britain? And they ask him specifically to travel to Britain, and they find out he's going to be the first ambassador to Britain under this new government for the most part. They choose John for a lot of reasons. Great relation. It's complicated, but for the most part, first off, he's already there. Second off, it's John Adams. He's this guy, this rambunctious individual. And King George is, I think, very interested to meet him. They have a very fascinating relationship, It's very cordial, I think there's some resentment for the most part. And I think King George, at the very least, thinks John Adams will understand. And I think he does, because when they actually talk, their correspondence is always peaceful and generally pretty respectful of one another, King George, when they talk, it's, I only did what I thought was best for my people, etc., etc. And John is like, hey, we do what we have to do, and not to mention too, like in terms of like true negotiations, there's really no one that's going to be better than John Adams, so if things go awry, he's going to basically just lay the smack down on King George for the most part, and there's really no one that's going to be better. And it sucks in some ways. John just wanted to go home. This is where the real correspondence between Abigail and him it's really beautiful, it's really good, and he's homesick. You know, he loves Europe. He thinks it's really a brilliant, beautiful place. But I don't think he sees it in the same light as, say, Thomas Jefferson would, in terms of, like, architecture, the people, and whatnot. What he does like is the thinking, the philosophical. That's this whole reason why he brought John Quincy Adams there, was just for schooling for the most part, and this French and British and all these different types of ideals that anyone could learn. It's a great childhood upbringing and learning. But for John Adams, he basically becomes the great British ambassador, the first ambassador to Great Britain in 1784 to 1785, and for the most part ends up just spending the next 4 years of his time there talking with King George, just basically talking to each other like, hey man, you aren't holding up your treaty of the Treaty of Paris, etc., and vice versa and whatnot, because you have to understand, like I said before, I think it's the part of Washington where I'm going to stay with Madison and Jefferson and Monroe, and specifically them, is that once the war is over, it's not over, technically speaking. They may have put sides away and withdrawn some troops from the main cities, but the British still occupy parts of the Northwest Territory, and the colonies aren't paying their debts. Because basically they agreed, hey, we'll leave if you pay this amount, and you guys can do your own thing. And the colonies can't do that because they can't collect taxes. They can't do anything. So the Articles of Confederation is a bullshit document that couldn't do anything. So, King George is pretty upset. He's just like, hey man, we'll leave the Northwest Territory if you start paying your fair sum and your fair due. And John Adams is like, okay, this is not good. This is not good. And he's basically just hammering out all the problems while he's telling people, hey, get your shit together, America. We gotta fucking do this. And that's when the Constitutional Convention happens. That's when a lot of things happen. And soon, effectively speaking, the Constitution eventually gets created. It's also too in Europe. He actually gets to be reunited with Thomas Jefferson. He comes to visit in Great Britain. He and his wife had actually been trying to pull strings to get Jefferson to France after his wife died, which I'm going to save for his episode. It's actually really, really, really sad, unfortunately. But he ends up and they rekindle their friendship and talk political ideas, etc., etc. And they really talk about what is going to happen in the future of this country. And both are very optimistic in a lot of aspects, in a lot of ways. But Jefferson's a little bit apprehensive, and you can see the tensions there in the very beginning. But effectively, after some time, in 1788. John Adams, after serving, for the better part of 4 to 5 years as the great British ambassador, says goodbye to King George one last time. They bid each other farewell as John Adams returns to America. So what does John Adams do in America around this particular point in time? It's a little complicated, okay? Because when he gets home, he tries to enjoy his life. He's probably trying to have sex with his wife. It's been a while, okay? So I don't blame him. Trying to get his dick wet. He tries to just enjoy his life for a little bit. He works on his farm, tries to restart his law practice, but at the very same time, things are moving fast. So by the time he comes back, there's a presidential election on the way. And he's actually seen as a bit of a potential frontrunner if Washington cannot accept, because you understand the first presidential election really is just convincing George Washington to be president. And if not, it's going to be John Adams. He's the leading voice of this radical revolutionary movement. Without him, a lot of things don't happen. Because you have to understand, this is how people saw John Adams. He's not a perfect person, and throughout his entire life, he's this brash, stubborn individual. He'd argue tooth and nail for things that seem inconsequential, but he'd argue for it if he's right. And even if he was technically wrong, if he felt that it was right, he would argue it. And that's just John Adams. Despite all that. Despite the personality, despite a lot of the things, brash nature, is very blunt nature. Excuse me. John Adams was a very popular figure, and one who they knew would work hard, would push hard, and would be an advocate and a representative of this country that they felt would be proper, at the very least, for the executive branch. So, in Washington, he gets elected as president. He ends up just taking the job because it's the right thing to do for Washington, and it's, they need him. They need Washington. Let's just be very clear about that. And then Adams, he gets the opportunity to be vice president. He gets the second most votes, and he doesn't like it. He doesn't want to be it, But he actually thinks about rejecting it, but he ends up taking it because he wants to save face, wants to do what's right by Washington and people, etc., etc. Even though Washington really he and his relationship really aren't particularly good. And before we continue, I should probably explain at least some of the relationships with some of the other founding fathers specifically, at the very least, or the important figures during that time. He's very close with Jefferson, very deeply close with Jefferson, actually, intellectually, emotionally. They actually grow their bond closer when Jefferson's wife dies, spending correspondence with one another. And Adams, Madison were big figures in him trying to get Jefferson to be the minister ambassador to France, to help with his grief for the most part. His relationship with Washington is complicated. He thinks highly of him, and I think Washington actually thinks highly of John Adams. He's a very honest, strong figure, but they don't like each other at the very least in terms of some personality traits, especially Washington to Adams. He thinks he's a bit boorish, a bit extra. Got to stop with that stuff, and it actually hurts their relationship for the most part, because Washington really doesn't have Adams in on the cabinet meetings, and it really makes their relationship sour. At least since the very end, Washington does ask a lot of Adams, at least for advice, near the end of his second term as president for the most part. And also, it showed signs that, Adams was probably going to be the second in line. He was going to be president eventually in what was, I guess you could say, the original line of succession before, because a lot of people thought he was going to be the guy after. I'll explain that in a little bit. His relationship with Hamilton's interesting. There's a lot more parallels and comparisons between these two in history than I think, like a lot of things happen. Like, they were both revitalized in the 21st century, historically speaking, and both Federalists. They were both in a similar vein, but they just did not like each other. They did not like the direction both of these guys were going to be going in. Although Adams tended to side with Hamilton, he's the party leader, and thought, he just went with him for the most part. He just went with his ideas. And how do I explain it? Hamilton and Adams did not like each other for political reasons, specifically, just like many of the founding fathers did not like each other. And Hamilton did not like Adams because he was too independent and too free-thinking away from what he wanted the country to be, and vice versa for Adams and Hamilton. And that was the one big thing that really drew them apart. He wasn't particularly close with Samuel Adams. They were related, and they often did come to each other for support, but eventually, just like many others, ideological differences would set them apart. Very close with Ben Franklin, etc., etc. And I would also point out, too, John Quincy Adams, his son. It's a very complicated relationship. He loved his son, and his son actually did love and respect his father, but it was a very strict relationship, especially when they were together. He's a very strong and stern father and wanted to have his children succeed in many ways, and that actually ruined a lot of the relationships with his younger kids because they were not capable and ready. And John Quincy Adams effectively would be the one to step up and actually be that kind of person. He had a leg up, unfortunately, for better or worse, but it is what it is. And he was initially against a lot of the stuff with his father and stuff, but he understood. And effectively, actually, ironically, kind of became the similar person to his father in a lot of ways and aspects. So, ironically, one of the longest periods of his time was being a vice president. It's also probably going to be the shortest in this episode. He doesn't really do a lot, other than argue what, Washington should be called. He argues that he should be called a king, etc., etc., and a lot of people didn't like him. And he would spend an hour trying to argue this for the most part for specific reasons, even though it's arbitrary, to be honest, a lot of the stuff that that happens during the vice presidency. Because you have to understand, the vice presidency, and the first vice president, by the way, is John Adams. He's the first. He didn't really do a lot with it. And the truth is that it was a bit of a vague position for the most part, And they ultimately just he effectively, in a role that he in some ways created himself, but the Constitution itself was that he was effectively just the leader of the Senate for the most part. And even then, he just showed remarkable stubbornness and an inability to really talk to people and effectively communicate. He was very combative in the early part of his vice presidency, which really ruined a lot of his time and a lot of his, legislation there. They just didn't listen to him. And they got to a point where he just, okay, you know what, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to, whatever, And for the most part, during his entire vice presidency, nothing really happens. He ends up following Washington and votes in favor of Washington and a lot of his, policies for the most part. And, the vice president effectively is the deciding vote for the most and all he does is just decide in favor of Washington. He doesn't do much. He doesn't say anything. He actually keeps it pretty fair for the most part. It's a very interesting time. The only thing that I would say is specifically around this particular time as vice president is the growing distance between him and Jefferson. And specifically, he's one of the very few casualties, along with many of the other historical figures and founding fathers around that time, of the eventual ideological differences, between the two people and between the two parties for the most part. And for him, being a Federalist, effectively being a part of the Federalist Party, and Jefferson being part of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican Party, a lot of them would have, ideological battles. They would disagree a lot, and they wouldn't really be with each other for the most part and talk to each other. And effectively, it was really difficult around that time for John Adams, because a lot of his friends and a lot of the people that he respected and a lot of the people that he would be part of were a part of that particular party. And it's difficult, As Washington's presidency is winding down, it's very clear that he's not going to come back for a third term. This is where things get interesting. So I think the first election in this country's history is really the election of 1797. Elections back then were strange, a little bit different. They handled things a lot differently. It was actually really negative if you campaigned to be president for the most part. A lot of people found that really distasteful. It really didn't happen until William Henry Harrison, I would probably say, like the early to mid 1800s. They don't really campaign. It was basically just like people were just chilling. This, I guess you could say like this goes apart with Washington's disinterested nature and whatnot. But for the most part, other people were doing the talking for you and talking around that particular time for you, like newspapers, for instance, and they would basically just be releasing articles, etc., etc. Understand too that there were multiple newspapers in like certain towns and cities that were specifically political newspapers. Like the Federalists had their own newspaper and the Democratic Republicans had their own newspaper. And they just be throwing jabs at each other. And, it's kind of fascinating when you really look at it, because most of the political attacks and the influence would be about who read what newspaper when. And a lot of people knew this, too. But for the most part, a lot of it was basically just political battles through media in some way, shape, or form, and word of mouth. The newspaper attacks were brutal. You think it's bad today. I mean, they were bad. Ugly, hatred, lies, I think it might have been the following election, but for Thomas Jefferson, this whole Sally Hemings affair was basically brought up as, scandal for the most part that would ruin the Jeffersons and the Jeffersonian, ideals and whatnot. So, I actually think I want to go into elections for other episodes too, because I think every single election, most of the elections are really fascinating. But for the most part, the very bare bones details you have to understand about this election is that it is specifically between a couple other people. But the main front runners for this particular election was Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, the Federalist and the Democratic Republican. Adams, the Federalist, and Democratic Republican. Jefferson, for the most part. And, they were always, and you have to understand too, the same thing in terms of modern day, I guess you could say, in which you ran on a specific platform or, specific perspective, and, if you were a Jefferson, you probably were thinking at this point, like, because, I guess you could say attacks-wise, Federalists were basically being attacked for being kind of like monarchs a little bit authoritarian in a lot of ways. In fairness, a lot of it, at the very least, perceived and in some instances was constitutionally violated, which I do agree with that aspect. Eventually the Alien Sedition Act is an example of that. But the Federalists did a lot of stuff like that in terms of trying to keep the country safe from their own perspective. And then the Democratic Republicans were basically, aligned with these French revolutionaries, because you have to understand and remember too, the French Revolution was basically happening. It was basically almost over. I think Napoleon around this point in time was effectively about to take over around the beginning of Jefferson's presidency. But this was a very tricky time, specifically with France. And, a lot of people didn't like France. And a lot of people were having problems with France, and specifically merchant ships and whatnot. That would lead to a lot of problems with Adams' presidency, eventually and specifically. So, effectively speaking, they all campaigned on their own specific things. If Adams was president, he was going to be strong, hard, and continue a lot of the good things that Washington was doing. Because you have to understand, he's going to be the second president. Whoever gets this position is going to be following Washington. So he's playing on that political idea of, I'm going to just continue what's going to happen for the most part. And Jefferson's basically like, look, the French are ruining a lot of things. If you vote me for president, I'll make things a lot simpler and have better relations with France so they don't keep doing these things. And this is a very crucial time because there's no one other than Washington. This is, in a lot of senses, an end of an era. Okay? You have to understand it. It's really not, but the end of an era because Washington is America at this point. Okay? From 1775 to 1797, it is Washington. It's Washington. And who's going to take over that mantle, I think, is really important to think about and to conceptualize here. It's very important. Who's going to lead this nation? And I mean lead this nation. Okay, and that's why this election is very, very important. Because whoever gets to lead this nation is going to be taking over Washington. They're going to get this level of positive or negative notoriety. They're going to be the leader of America, the thing that they fought for. That's why this election is really important. And would, at least in a lot of people's minds, change the direction of how this country would go. So how does this election work? How did this election work? Because you have to understand, too, the first, I would say, 5 or 6 elections were very interesting and tricky, because you don't really vote like you do today, where you vote and then you're actually voting for an actual elector for the most part, who's going to basically follow what you're going to do for the most part in terms of your electoral votes. It's very different. The people had some influence, but for the most part, votes initially in the first couple elections specifically were by state legislatures. Okay, and by a very, very narrow margin. So if you're going to actually win and influence people, you're going to... And don't get me wrong, it's similar in the sense of electoral college. Excuse me. And it's still an electoral college, but just went about it in a slightly different way, I guess you could say. So basically all you had to do was just try to win the state legislatures and a lot of the actual state people too. And Adams would win this eventually, but, this would later change along with the actual 12th Amendment. That would effectively change how voter rules will and how people would basically be the president and vice president. It's a lot of problems that came along with it. So effectively, Adams wins. He wins by about 3 electoral votes versus Jefferson. I think it was 71 to 68. Remember, only a couple. The 13 states plus the other 5 that were later admitted. The total of 18 states and a total of 18 electoral votes for the most part, based off of, relatively speaking, state population. You have to understand the reason why the 12th Amendment is really important is because back then, whoever got the second most votes was going to be your vice president. A lot of people debate this and it's complicated. It depends on how you interpret it, to be honest, and how this works. Because my original view of it is, in some way, shape, or form, they created this particular line of succession and the way this, how we elect people so that, the vice president can curtail some of the powers of the president if, the second person. I think things would be very different if, Democrats and Republicans were the vice president. It'd be very interesting. It'd be more of the, separation of powers to keep each other in balance. But also create a lot of problems because, not a lot of things got done, or it was, people nipping at your coattails and a lot of issues along with that, But effectively, John Adams wins technically the first presidential election, but the election of 1797, whatever specific year you want to call it. And he becomes the second president of the United States. And Thomas Jefferson, after years of solitude and away from the public office, effectively becomes the second vice president in the country's history from 2 different political ideologies. So when Adams becomes president, he becomes the first Federalist president. The only Federalist president, actually, to be honest. First partisan president. I think is really fascinating, interesting, And how do I explain his presidency? honestly. It's a little bit complicated. I look at presidents, I look at presidencies, and I look at, eras and times and whatnot. And the truth and reality is, which is unfortunate, is that, Adams' presidency is a very, influential aspect and period in time within this country's history. And it's a very important period of time, just like every single president, obviously. But, his is also just, unfortunately, just a bridge presidency between Washington and the beginnings of this country, effectively, into what the Jefferson and the Jeffersonian era presidencies would effectively be. And, for better or worse, a lot of people tend to look down on his presidency and who he is as a president, and I'm going to explain why I think it's a little more complicated than that. And, it really is a little more complicated than that because, I think we're influenced by a lot of political writings of the time, and I think we're influenced specifically in, some things that if we had better context, which again, it's things like this that I want to have and give better context for, because, I look at John Adams and I'm just thinking to myself, why don't I hate this person for a lot of the monarchical things that he ends up doing? And it's not all simple. It's very complicated, And for every president, I'm going to talk about at least the most important cabinet members and the most important judicial appointments, at the very least, for the most part. At least tell how many, little things. So for the most part, John Adams, more or less, other than some later appointments, keeps most of Washington's cabinet, keeps most of the Federalist cabinet at that point. Nothing really specific there. I mean, notably, John Marshall ends up becoming, I think later on, as Secretary of State, or one of the actual cabinet members. I'm blanking right now. I don't have it in front of me. But I know he becomes part of the cabinet, which is ironic, which I will explain in about 2 seconds. He does have a couple of judicial appointees, though. 3 of them, notably. A lot of them are just people who were part of the initial John Jay Corps, and they just leave. And notably, John Jay himself. The 2 most notable would be this one, Bushrod Washington, who is actually George Washington's nephew that he would appoint on relatively early on. And the second most important, which I think might be the most important judicial appointment in this country's history for the direction of the way this country would go, one of the most, I can't even fundamentally explain how important this decision is the appointment, ironically, of John Marshall, as Secretary of State, of one of the cabinet members, to the actual Chief Justiceship himself. Yeah, he was the Secretary of State. Because you have to understand, like, in terms of historically speaking, first off, he'd be on the court for the next 35 years, as a Federalist, and effectively just battling Thomas Jefferson and the Jeffersonian people for judicial appointments and everything. He'd be one of the leaders and effectively give the Supreme Court the specific power that it has, mainly with Marbury versus Madison. But that will be for Thomas Jefferson's episode specifically. Good. Excuse me, fucking tacos. I'm sorry. My stomach's not working with me. Anyways, you have to understand that, specifically speaking, he is one of the most consequential Supreme Court justice appointees in history. I think for the better in a lot of aspects, in a lot of ways, whether, your opinion of the Supreme Court is positive or negative. Understand, too, that, like, before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of it all, there's a lot of things that happen with John Adams. For instance, because at this point, the capital, Washington, never lived in D.C., but Adams would, and he actually be the first president to live in the newly constructed presidential mansion of the presidential White House. And just, let me give you some, preface for some of the things, because, like, once Washington leaves, the country's in a bit of an interesting point, at least economically speaking and technologically speaking. What I mean is that because the Industrial Revolution starts relatively early in Great Britain, but in some way, shape, and form, I would argue the Cotton Gin by Eli Whitney, I believe that was 1793, might be getting confused, but in the relatively late 1700s, early 1800s, the Industrial Revolution in some ways really begins, and it begins in the North specifically. That's at the very least what the economies were really pushing towards, factories in the North, and in some ways, you can argue this is where the Great Divide kind of begins, because the South really, because of the cotton gin, because they're selling a lot of the cotton to, Great Britain and a lot of these other countries, mainly Great Britain for, their textile factories for the, Industrial Revolution. They're going so far into the actual agricultural aspects of their economy for the most part. which is why I think it's interesting, because you have to understand that like a lot of this stuff comes with economic realities. You have to understand, for better or worse, economies will push people in a particular direction. This would eventually, later on, especially with the advent of slavery, push this country into civil war. That's another episode entirely. But for the most part, the economic recovery from the previous decades of war-torn debt, was working positively, especially with the new taxes, especially the increasing taxes that Adams would eventually put on for the rising board with increased budget and whatnot, which would be later frowned upon. But for the most part, economically speaking, the country was still in recovery and was still working out its kinks, and it was still working positively to a much better degree, to a better future. It was on the right path for it, for the most part. So with all the backstory, how does John Adams' presidency really starts? Well, you have to understand how it starts is basically how Washington's ends. The XYZ affair. It's a very complicated issue, but I'll just give you some backstory that Washington had previously sent Charles Pinckney to basically talk things out, mainly because the Jay Treaty had happened. France was upset because it violated a lot of long-standing agreements, et cetera, with between America and France, and it was the treaty itself was a treaty. The Jay Treaty itself was actually a treaty that was really beneficial for America and Great Britain, not France for the most part, and Washington tried to sort things out in terms of neutrality, but didn't really work out. When Adams becomes president, he sends like a shit ton more people. John Marshall, notably, again. Marshall's everywhere, and this motherfucker. And then they basically go over there. They try to meet with France, and a lot of the people are not there. So the foreign minister is basically just like, no, we're not in negotiations at all. So then they try to meet with people, and then there's 3 people that the foreign minister sends to basically meet with them. They're like, look, if you want to have a speech with us, you got to pay us a shit ton of money, and it's going to happen, or otherwise it's not good. And let's just put it this way. They basically just tried to basically say, hey, if you pay us this, then you can talk to us, and et cetera, et cetera. It's a little more complicated and specifically detailed than that, but I'll put it to you this way. It was not a very positive way they went about doing it. And they basically try to bribe us into basically trying to have good relations for the most part and extort America in some way, in shape, and form. At the very least, that was some of the perception of it. Adams gets word of this, and you can just imagine John Adams hearing this, like, these motherfuckers, He gets word of this, and he starts thinking, okay, this is, something's going to happen, like understand the whole purpose of the Constitution was so that, it's in the Federalist Papers too. I think it was actually John Jay or Hamilton that might have wrote it, but about, the foreign influence, it's human nature, people, power. Some people might say it's even competence, because the more power you have, the more capabilities you have, the more efficient you're going to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Depends on how you look at it. But for the most part, Adams, being the Republican person himself, is like, okay, this is a real test for us. This is a real moment in time for how, it's going to be, in some way, shape, or form, how his presidency is going to go. It's this French affair. And understand that, at the very least, he is preparing. So he starts getting the military ready. And people in the legislature are not hearing what's happening with France for the most part. He's kind of keeping it quiet. He's basically saying, French relations we're working on it for the most part. And Thomas Jefferson and people of the opposition party are basically just like, look, man, yo, what the fuck? What's happening? Tell us, man. You're lying to us. And Jefferson's basically, put it plainly, he's just beating the drum, like, tell us what they said, and we'll let the people decide and figure it out. Because Jefferson, it's a little bit of a political thing. Jefferson's like, look, the French can't be that bad. They're my homies. I'm these revolutionary people. And then Adams is like, you know what, fuck you. And then just decides, screw it, I'll just tell people. Then he tells people. He tells the people. And it makes Jefferson look a little bit of a fool for the most part. And everyone's mad. The American people are mad. Everyone's upset. Et cetera, et cetera. And it's a very testy time for America. And, Adams was a very opportunistic person, too, just like any of the other politicians and historical political figures, too. So, don't get me wrong. And he used this opportunity to really strengthen the military, increase the federal budget, et cetera, taxes. This is a very tricky time because a lot of things are happening within, like, I'd say 2 to 3 years of Adams' initial presence. I mean, it is complicated, Like, do you think Trump's presidency is complicated in his first 4 years? Or, I don't know, we don't know if he's going to be elected or not, at least in the recording of this episode. It's probably likely, but still. Point being, though, like, a lot of things were happening during Adams' presidency, back to back to back to back to back. He increases the military and effectively, in some ways, really expands and creates the Navy. You can argue, back and forth. A lot of people are credited with it, but it is Adams specifically that I would say, in most cases, could be considered the father of the Navy. At least the gross expansion of it, and whatnot. It's around this time too that the rising taxes. People are not happy. He's not a popular person just with the taxes alone. Let's just be honest there. And it's around this time too. There's a lot of French people immigrating, mainly because they're trying to escape the fucking French Revolution. I don't want any fucking guillotines or anything. I don't blame them. But a lot of them are coming, and there's suspicion, maybe some spying going on. There's a lot of these French. In fairness, who likes the French people? Come on. Come on. I don't even have to. Come on. Anyways, the French are coming, and they're basically just. There's too many of them coming at this point. It's enough for Adams to really start worrying. So they start what would be known the Alien Sedation Acts. A lot of these things, and it starts with the immigration policy. Because you have to understand, the Alien Sedation Acts is complicated, and it's something that it's a lot of things, but specifically like 4 or 5 specific legislative acts, back to back to back to back, that effectively, alien sedation. It's both immigration and, specifically in this particular case, restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of the press in some way, shape, or form. Because that's how it started, though. It started with, and obviously it broke a shit ton of constitutional rules. But for the most part, they were just basically trying to limit immigration and them bad-mouthing the country and the federal government for trying to stop these French people for the most part, even though it's wrong in some way, shape, or form. And a lot of people made case, they got jailed for this. Only like 8 or 9 people really did. So I think what I'm trying to say is people are overblowing the Alien Sedation Acts in a very negative light. Were they bad? Absolutely. They were horribly bad, unconstitutional in every sense of the word, and should never pass to begin with. And they were passed by a Federalist majority Congress, I might want to point out at that point. I believe Senate and the House. I'm not positive on that. But in order to get those things through, they had to go through a shit ton of stuff, and that's the only way I think it was going to happen. Those acts actually ruined his presidency and effectively ruined any chance that he had, I think, in some way, shape, or form, to get a second term. That was a big thing. Once you break constitutional rules and stuff, this document that you, as a big believer in republicanism and whatnot, it's tough, And you have to understand John Adams too, because throughout this entire time, when he's in Europe, he's so focused. He's just trying to get things done while dealing with his depression and whatnot, and trying to be home with his family and life. And he's just thinking, and he's just trying to figure things out. And he just wants to go home and do his things too. And he's a human being. We're all capable of making mistakes, and especially as a president, you have to understand and be put in his shoes, I probably should have done this more about Adams in terms of how he's feeling during certain acts, but throughout the European Revolution war times. Although that's pretty simple because he's just basically focused on winning the war. That's his ultimate goal, and trying to keep things together because he's always working. But during his presidency, he becomes a little bit different. He actually becomes, I would say, a little bit worried in some way, shape, and form. I think he tends to be painted in such a negative light. I don't think that's an accurate and fair statement. He's always conscientious in thinking. He's always thinking about what's going to be better for the country. And I think it's really fascinating in a lot of ways, Although with some some political stuff that goes along with it too. When he's trying to build the army up, he appoints George Washington to be the leader of this, the leader in arms again, etc., or whatever, the leader in arms, instead of Alexander Hamilton, who actually was a much younger, much better choice, because Washington's 65 and he wants to retire. And Washington goes to a couple meetings and then just gives it to Hamilton, but he doesn't give it to Hamilton because of politics, basically. So, understand, being the president, when once you're the president, a lot of things happen, a lot of problems, a lot of responsibility. It's a difficult position and it's a difficult thing. It's actually I will say they do pretty well in the John Adams series. How he's feeling during the presidency. I think they get that right. At the very least, he's just focused. He's just trying to do things. A lot of things can be overwhelming, especially when you're the president for the most part. I think in some way, shape, and form, he understood too that once these, Alien Station Acts happened, and once, the backlash was so severe, and that they were going to use it against him, and I think in some ways he probably thought this was going to be like the thing that was going to be better for the country, and because these acts wouldn't be repealed until like a couple years into Jefferson's term, actually. But he's always thinking for the betterment of the country, which I think is probably some of the biggest problems with Adams functionally, which he would not do until later into his life, is that he just could not learn from the mistakes or see things in a different light, in a different particular way. Once you get into that mindset, I'm telling you, it's hard to get out of it. It's hard to think in a different light, in a different perspective. Anyways, back off into his actual presidency itself. These Alien Sedition Acts, and then it's just the absolute substantial increase of federal powers, I might want to add, because you have to understand this is a gross increase in federal powers. So while the acts would be reduced, the actual broad, federal capabilities were widened at that point. And that would be the one big thing about Adams' presidency, is Washington didn't really do that much in terms of the expansion of the federal powers, at the very least, aside from the economic recoveries and whatnot. But for the most part, Adams was the big one. Adams starts it, and Jefferson just takes off with it, and Madison, what I'm saying? It just keeps going up and up and up and up from there. Adams' presidency is the presidency that starts the course of where we're at now, at least in terms of, I would say, the size of the federal government in a lot of ways. But, this really puts the opposition into, the forefront for the most part. Jefferson, Madison, Madison was basically opposition. He was the House leader at that point, or the leader of his specific party. I think he would leave, actually, after midway through Adams's turn. But basically, even Hamilton was against the actual aggressive expansion of the actual federal powers, and creating resolutions of the separation of the Union. Like, a lot of these states were basically wary of it. You think, like South Carolina seceding from this. Nah, like Kentucky was one of the first states to, like, basically kind of teeter that line a little bit, the Kentucky resolutions, which was basically states' rights to override the actual federal powers themselves. A lot of tension between the federal powers and the states started in Adams' presidency. It wasn't perfect, before the Civil War. There would be many moments, notably in Andrew Jackson's presidency, actually, where things started getting really testy around that period in time. What is undeniable, though, is that the increase of the actual, army, the military, the federal powers or whatnot. France was seeing a lot of this too, and they were getting a little bit antsy, so they started increasing their attacks, and then the United States started fighting back, and it is known as the Quasi-War. The Quasi-War had just started, and again, like I said before, he chose Washington instead of Hamilton, but that was more of a political thing. Once Hamilton effectively does become the actual leader to lead this quasi-war, Hamilton, in his own Federalist light, is basically like, look, man, if we're going to be on the same page, then we're going to do this right. So he ends up asking and wanting more war and more expansion. And it's difficult because, Adams didn't want an actual war. He just did it for protection and protectionary causes, but... And this is probably the biggest problem with Hamilton in some aspects, is just he overreaches sometimes, and I think he overthinks. And don't get me wrong, I think he's a fantastic warrior, leader, strategist, and whatnot. And I think if anyone's going to lead us into this, it's probably Hamilton. But there's limits. Hamilton did not understand these limits. Okay, I take it back. He did understand these limits, but I don't think he cared. And I actually think that's actually worse in some ways. But, they would basically both be battling each other this entire time for, the direction of what the Federalist Party was going to be, and, what was going to happen. So basically, Hamilton's very war. Adams is not a very war person. It was already bad enough with his image, and in fairness, the people did want war. They were mad. They were not very happy. I mean, there's a lot of people that didn't. There's a lot of people who are still loyalists to French and thought in line with a lot of these French revolutionaries. And because the thing you have to understand is that there's always going to be disagreements. And even back then, it's not like everyone was aligned politically speaking or ideologically speaking. Even back then, people were like, yeah, "You're a French lover, you fucking, you love your biscuits and stuff. You British lover with the Jay Treaty and things." And people it's just human nature to disagree. And Adams was very keenly aware of this, or at least he tried to be as keenly aware of this as much as possible. So, during this entire time, Adams is trying to negotiate peace. He's been trying to talk to France as much as possible against, Hamilton's opposition to British unity for the most part. Because you have to understand, Britain and France still don't like each other. There's increasing tensions, and it'll only get worse and worse and worse. Because Hamilton saw this as, if we, become homies with France, Britain's not going to like this for the most part. Not to mention, too, let's just actually be united with Britain. Let's just fucking go for it. Let's just be homies with them. You know what I'm saying? And Adams is, is a little apprehensive to that idea, because Hamilton's basically thinking, if we can just get trade and become these economic combined superpowers and stuff, that'd be great. But Adams is very apprehensive to that idea, and he's president, so it's a little bit difficult. And I guess it's a little bit, man, this is a very tricky time. And so many things are happening. He's increasing the federal powers, he's increasing all the taxes. Understand, this is another rebellion. Fry's rebellion happens during this time. This would be a really, really, really bad mark on his presidency. No, I would note though that despite the rebellion, he actually pardons Fry. So basically during this quasi-war, it lasts for at least a couple of years of just increased French tensions. Understand too that this is 2 years, and other than maybe some skirmishes and whatnot, nothing really happens. It's just tensions, people losing their minds left and right. Man, this French tensions and whatnot. These fucking French people, and they're gonna attack us. It's, I don't want to say it's media or propagating all of this, but it has an absolute influence, and at the very least, the direction that the country goes. I mean, just think about it. It's kind of like even today in some aspects. I like to connect the parallels in some ways. That I look at today, for instance, and I think oh, the French are coming, or not the French, but you know what I mean, a parallel. And then, but we live our lives day by day, and nothing really happens, and yet there's heightened tensions for reasons. And I think even then, media was a very big influence back then, especially with the two different newspapers and political ideologies that go along with those newspapers, and just people in general. It's always political. I swear, it's even back then. People need to understand it wasn't like everyone was united. Even political, little deals and back deals, it was always happening, even back then. So basically, during the later years of Adams' presidency, the French Revolution effectively ends. Okay, and Napoleon ends up taking over, and it coincides with Hamilton being the leader of the army, which he ended up just disbanding the army after that, basically, because Napoleon's like, okay, we're done. We're just going to end all this stuff. So Adams basically just had to hold out for the most part during this entire time. And I gotta be honest, this is a very difficult time for Adams, especially near the end of his presidency. Not a lot gets done. A lot of things are very difficult to really explain for the most part, because his entire presidency is just completely dominated by this entire war, this entire thing, and the political pot shots being taken off by the Democratic Republicans, and Hamilton, for the most part, really just slyly just tearing him down as little by little, as much as he can, because the Federalist Party is gone at this point. I think the Federalist Party is gone at this point. Once Hamilton and Adams basically just fight each other for the most part, it creates two separate factions. You have the Adams camp and the Hamilton camp. And don't be wrong, I think the Democratic Republicans are very strong too, But I mean, if they were united behind Adams, they probably still win the presidency. I would probably say it's a very what if moment in history. I would say. So while the party's a little bit split, Adams does try to get as much as he can done, and it is debatable. I think he thinks he has a chance to win, but the truth is I think he also understands that he probably won't. I think he's understanding of this reality in some way, shape, or form. I think he's optimistic, but everything's pointing to a lot of things that have happened in his first 3 years of his presidency that make it highly unlikely that he's going to get reelected again. So, he just basically tries to do as much as he can, especially since there's so much political infighting between Hamilton and Adams. He establishes the Federal Bankruptcy Act in 1800s, which its purpose is to protect traders from debtors, especially since people are still trying to get out of debt, and it's unfortunate. People were basically just being ruined by debtors, unfortunately. Yeah, local and whatnot. And then, on top of that, he establishes the Library of Congress and, of course, the White House, obviously. And, the Treaty of Mortefontaine effectively ends the Quasi-War itself. And little tidbit, too, actually gives the last State of the Union address that would basically last until for about 113 years. I think it was Woodrow Wilson. I forgot which president it was specifically. Anyways, effectively, that is ultimately the end of his presidency, since he would lose in the next election. But I'll get to the next election in just a little bit, because I just want to do a quick review of his presidency for the most part, which I'm going to do for every other president as well. So let me explain it this way. It was a very tumultuous presidency, and there's so many factors that go into it that I didn't even fundamentally go into, because it's so many things that all coincide with one another. War, political fighting, media bias, poor reactions in many ways to a whole bunch of different legislation. You can argue French influence, British influence, just cultural influence, economic influence. Because you have to understand, just like with many of these presidents and many of these people, there's so many different factors that go into so many different things. It's not just one thing. It's many different things that coincide to create the specific event and the things that will happen that change history. It's a multivariate analysis of history, The revolution wasn't one with one person. It was one with Washington. It was one with Adams. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Benjamin Franklin helped try to do the Treaty of Paris, Like Marshall and Monroe both fought in the war. Like, everyone did their part, and every single person had some role to play within the war itself. And in history, in every single moment in history. And Adams' presidency is really no different. And it's also tough to follow George Washington and be the second of George Washington. Are you going to continue the same things that you were going to continue, or are you just going to do your own thing? What do you do as a second president? Because your president's going to really determine what the next president's going to do, and the other future presidents, or what they're going to do, And I think that's really interesting. He followed Washington, and, he always screwed. And in some ways, he was just screwed because of that. But, and he did not follow the examples and got it in his own way, obviously, as, people took advantage, namely Jefferson, Madison, and all that. But I will say this is, while I think his presidency is ultimately a failure, and I think it's much more of a failure of the actual party itself. I'm not the biggest fan of political parties, but I fundamentally understood why they were created, and I would say this is more so just the failure of people on his side, people who respected him, and people who actually were ideologically aligned with him, failing to help him, failing to be a part of that. And it's like, say what you will about the Republicans and Trump, for instance, but they got behind him. And I think partly, I don't know if that was, I don't think Adams is obviously an influence specifically for the ideological alignment and backing him, but it's just logic at that point. And Adams had no support. He's like Jimmy Carter in some ways. I think it's really interesting, at least in terms of just the overall support, because he pushed a lot of people away too. But that being said, despite him being an overall failure as a presidency, I can't fault it to be on him. He did not help because of his brash nature, and he only continued to push people away. But I think his presidency was just doomed from the start because of both just him following Washington, and everyone was out to get John Adams. And that's why I think, he's an unfortunate recipient of history in so many ways. So what happens? The election year. The president only serves 4 years a term. And the election of 1800 was against, again, Thomas Jefferson, notably Aaron Burr, too, at this point, And this was another election that was immensely fierce, And at the very least, ideologically speaking, the election was based off of a different set of values and principles. Because before, it was Jefferson was like, I will help these French relations. And now he's basically saying, I am the president of the people. Effectively what a lot of the Democratic Republican people and the party itself would represent. I am for the people, not these rich people and these, federalist ideas and whatnot, etc., etc. And don't get me wrong, I don't like political parties, but a lot of people bought this message. They understood this message, and they actually really got behind this message. And a lot of people, there's a reason why there's several, I would say 4 consecutive presidents that would be Democratic Republicans. Understand that. It was the party of the people and not the actual nationalist idea. And Adams is basically like being painted as this monarchical figure for the most part. And he was basically just like, Rumpf, I'm King Adams, etc., etc. Yeet, And I'll put it to you this way. This is actually the first true election of actual ideological parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, specifically as like fully formed actual parties, I believe at this point. And and the election was very contested. Adams was basically just saying, look, man, I did not get us into war. I should be at least, give me another chance, another 4 years, and now I can actually start implementing a lot of the things that I want to implement and do a lot of the things that I want to do. And Jefferson, again, the man of the people. And that's just how people saw it, along with Aaron Burr to an extent. But Aaron Burr was much more of a political savvy figure at that point in time. And 2 things happened specifically, or 2 things ruined any chance that Adams had. First and foremost was just him. Adams was just not a politically savvy figure. He was always going to get in his own way. It's the same problem that would happen with his son, unfortunately, in terms of the politics of the future. And Adams it was tough. It's very tough. Adams, he's so independent-minded thinking, and that's a beautiful, brilliant thing. But if you don't know how to play the political game, which I hate the political game, but you have to play it, or you're not going to get any support because these people at this point are still in power. And it's just like even today, you have to do it if you're going to get your way and get your win. And he just ruined it just by doing the things that he did ultimately throughout his entire presidency, and then ultimately near the end of his presidency. And then number 2 was Hamilton. Hamilton made a pamphlet. This pamphlet was basically anti-Adams and the specifics of why he's a failure of a president. And that pamphlet was so atrociously negative to just who Adams was and his character, etc., that I would say that's probably one of the biggest things that actually helped Adams functionally lose the presidency. He hated Jefferson, like I said before, ideologically speaking. He hated Burr more. I don't think he liked Burr specifically, although Burr, ironically, was someone who, at that point, had stopped him from going into a duel with James Madison at that point in time. That was when the Reynolds affair was happening. But he had detested Adams at this point as a man who basically was leading his party, or at least, what he believes his section of the party, down a path that he did not think was going to be conducive for the nation. Both in terms of the media and in terms of just the direction, legislatively speaking, and economically speaking, too. So, what happens? Jefferson and Aaron Burr tie for the electoral vote, with Hamilton pulling the strings to get Jefferson for the most part. Well, no, it's debatable Hamilton, but I would say Hamilton helped pull the strings to get Jefferson the actual presidency himself. And John Adams gets 3rd place. Understand, because, in a lot of people's minds, if you're going to be president, you serve 8 years at this point. And it was custom. And it sounds weird to say what that was a custom, but, the thought was if you're president, you're going to serve 2 terms, not 1 term, 2 terms. And to Adams, for him to only serve one term, to feel like a failure as a president and as a man, that's got to be haunting. He was embarrassed. He felt ridiculed and ashamed. So ridiculed and ashamed that, someone he was so close with, one of his friends, would actually, have the audacity to be president just like him. When Jefferson was inaugurated, he didn't even attend the inauguration itself. Ironically, the only two presidents that wouldn't do that would be him and his son. It's fascinating. Very, very fascinating. Well, anyways, Adams, after the 4 years of his presidency, decides he's going to finally and fully retire. So what does he do? What does John Adams do in his retirement? He goes home. I understand a lot of these people end up going home. It sounds pretty fucking obvious, but honestly, he went home. He went back to farming. He retired from being a lawyer, and he just wanted to be home with Abigail, be home with his family. His family life was a little bit tumultuous at that point in time. But for the most part, he's basically just out of it. He's done. He's out of politics. He doesn't really even pay much attention to it. He lets Jefferson do his thing. He doesn't try to critique anything. He ends up being relatively, apolitical. It's very interesting. It's very interesting. I think, let me explain my thought process, because I read some of the writings during this period in time for Adams. And it's very different from his older years, or younger years. I think for the very first time, he reflects. And a lot of this is with his correspondence with Jefferson, which I'll get to in just a little bit. And I don't know if it's just because, when you get later in life, I'm a very young person, so I'm not going to be able to get to that point in time in my life until, hopefully decades from now, effectively. John Adams is a very empathetic, sympathetic man. He's the kind of person that has this really tough exterior, brash personality. Once you really understand who he is, and especially with his correspondence with Abigail, it shows that this man is a really brilliant, empathetic, and sympathetic man. But once, he gets in a particular mindset, it's tough to get out of it. And I think for the first time, though, I think he finally changes kind of like the personality in some senses of who he is and stops being that person. I think he stops really taking a lot of that anger with him and a lot of that frustration and that fierce, ferocious debater kind of personality with him. And I think part of that's age. You just get old, and then, I'm tired. Because at this point, what is it? 1801, John Adams is probably close to 70 at this point. Or, let me see, he's mid-60s, early 60s at this point. You get old. And he would live for a very long time. He's actually probably the oldest founding father, I believe. Or one of the oldest. And he reflects. I think he actually starts seeing things in a much more empathetic and sympathetic way. Like his train of thought really changes, and he changes the way he thinks in many aspects. I think is a really beautiful and really understanding way, especially when he thinks about, the French Revolution, the Republic, and the Republican ideal, and I'll explain a little bit about that with a correspondence with Jefferson a little bit later. So he takes his time, he follows politics a little bit, and he's basically just relaxing. He's enjoying whatever time left he has on this earth, effectively, and in fairness, he would have a lot of time. He'd be living for another 28 years or so after his presidency. So he's just enjoying his life. And every now and then, I guess you could say in some instances, when he would get political during the actual presidency, it was only just to refute the negative things that certain political figures would say. Hamilton, Jefferson, excuse me, Madison, especially Jefferson, in fairness, aggressively so. He and Jefferson would not speak for a very long time. His wife and another person, I forgot who, another relatively known but B-list kind of founding father and historical figure, I would say. They start this correspondence. She starts this correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, try and patch things up. It's more of just like, hey, how you doing? It's been a while. We won't write to each other anymore. And Jefferson's like, oh, I know. So, yeah, how's John? Is he okay? Oh, he's fine. You should talk to him and stuff. He's like, I don't want to talk to him. And then it's like, just, getting two people who want to talk to each other on the phone, just like, oh, hey, what's up? It's kind of funny. So basically what I'm trying to say is Abigail Adams, before her death, I believe in 1817, she would die much younger than Adams, would basically start this correspondence with Jefferson, so that eventually blossoms into John Adams eventually sending letters to Jefferson and vice versa. And they would actually have a beautiful correspondence between the two of them that would effectively last the entirety of their life, the rest of their lives for the most part. Adams sent a lot more letters. I think he was very, very, once Abigail dies, he's basically just this old man writing constantly at his house. He does a lot of things too, obviously, but for the most part, his family just takes care of him, or some of his kids take care of him, and he just starts this correspondence with them, and it's really beautiful and brilliant. A lot of things get hashed out. They become friends again. They reflect on all the times that they've had before. And I would go into much more detail into his retirement years, but nothing really pertinent comes from it, really. The two of them basically just have this beautiful and the most important thing is basically just these two having a beautiful correspondence about everything that they've done, And in fairness, Jefferson doesn't even want to talk about this. He just wants to just be like, so, how's your Tuesday, for instance, And Adams is basically adamant, but he accepts to an extent. He's like, well, I'd rather just at least explain my perspective on things, because I know I did some wrong things, and I just want to, explain my piece, etc., etc. It's beautiful. Because you have to understand, look at it back then, Washington in Lafayette, that was the closest thing to like a father-son relationship that you're ever going to get for the most part, but there's no communication in the way we have it today. And we're blessed to have that, and they didn't have that back then. And I mean, they really didn't, when Washington last sees Lafayette really for the last time, obviously they don't know it's going to be the last time, but Lafayette's going over to France, and they really don't know if they're going to see each other again. They wouldn't, unfortunately. And Washington, for one of the very few times in his life, actually gets really, really noticeably emotional and sad. And Lafayette, makes these things, and it's like, I will never forget you, my friend. My surrogate father in some way, shape, or form, etc., etc. Lafayette, yeah. For them to basically just make up the way that they did and have this beautiful correspondence and talk about the things that they do and the things that they did. I think if people get an opportunity, they should read these, because, obviously when you send a letter back, like now, it's really not going to be. The letters back then were like fucking like a shit ton of pages, okay? Like, they're explaining everything. And like one correspondence, the one I'm going to talk about later to end this thing, it's really, really fucking long. Really long. It's several pages long. And it's hyper specific and hyper detailed, and it goes into a bunch of philosophy. It's incredible. And I'll explain it in a little bit. Their correspondence would last them the entirety of their lifetimes. Adams would grow old. He'd be a very old man. He would live for a very long time, long enough to see his own son become the 6th president of the United States of America. That's something else. Only one other person can say that. George W. Bush, if you don't know. George H.W. Bush. But his health is growing old. By the time his son becomes president, he's 88 years old. The letters become less frequent. They both send their last letters to each other. And then one day, on the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the 50th anniversary, I might add, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, they've both been in grave ill health for quite some time, actually. And both of them are just basically strong enough to pull through until that particular day. John Adams, his last words, Jefferson lives. And then he dies. Well, not like that, obviously. I'm being dramatic here. I don't know why I'm being dramatic. Both of them die on July 4th, 1776. It's ironic because Jefferson had died a couple hours earlier. It's fascinating. We've had Monroe would also die on 1776 too, July 4th as well, 1831 or 1731, no 1831, and it just makes you go, what the fuck? Sometimes, you know. Madison was actually really close to passing away on that day, but he ended up passing and dying just a couple days earlier than that. History is very fascinating. Fate is very fascinating. You know, when you talk about a true beautiful friendship between Jefferson and Adams, it's fascinating. I don't know. I think about that and I'm just, words can't describe it. So, how do we remember John Adams? How do we remember his legacy, his life? It's very complicated. You know, just like every single one of these presidents. First off, he's a man. He's a human being. Human nature, we're all capable of this. We're all capable of understanding. We're all capable of good things, you know. Like I said before, he's this very complicatedly simple man. Or he's a complicated man by simple means. Sorry, I'm getting my things mixed up, you know. Like I say, he's a rebel at heart. He just doesn't care. He's going to do what he wants to do because he's, again, the most independent-minded individual. Easily the most independent-minded individual of all the founding fathers, you know. And it worked to his benefit and his detriment, you know. But, you know, once I do all this research and I'm trying to compile all the evidence, like, because if I did every little detail, minute detail that I was able to uncover about some of these people, this episode would probably be about 5 to 6 hours long, and it's a lot. And it goes into a whole bunch of different details from a whole bunch of different things. You know, like once you go into the XYZ factor, it's like you gotta go into why John Marshall was even appointed there, or how Pinckney even got there to begin with. As it's a whole bunch of different things. But the truth is, you know, after doing all my looking and see how these people, you know, would be as presidents and how their presidencies have been affected. You know, for John Adams in particular, I look at him and I don't know if he was ever going to be a good president. You know, that would probably be the one negative downfall I would probably have to say about John Adams. And, you know, different people have different interpretations of how the president should be run and how they should go for the most part. But, and this also goes along with his son too, because a lot of people say his son is the most qualified person to be president. And look, foreign policy and, you know, treaties and negotiations, that's great. And that's absolutely necessary. But does that make you a leader? Does that make you someone who's economically viable and capable of, you know, running an economy or basically trying to legislate fairly and objectively as possible? You know, it's more than just that. Even back then, it's a whole bunch of different multivariate analysis factors that basically what makes a good president, you know? And what specific duties and details are necessary and required for a president. Like Washington's presidency, all that was required of him was just to hold things together. You know, you could say the same thing for Adams, but, you know, a lot of things, like war was upon Adams' presidency. So does that mean he failed in that endeavor regardless? And I think he probably would have failed just because of his personality. And, well, in fairness, he did fail because of his personality, but most likely because he failed because people were trying to interfere aggressively so, you know. So don't get me wrong, his presidency was a failure. And I think history in some way, shape, and form is correct in the sense of, you know, it wasn't, there is a reason why he is not remembered as fondly as, say, the other founding father. Well, that being said, though, the truth is there is no hesitation of his overall patriotism to this country, the level of importance that he is to this country. You know, with John Adams, the revolution goes very differently. You know, John Adams, you know, being the president that he is, I don't know what would happen if he got another term, you know. And in fairness, I will say that despite me thinking that, I don't think he probably would have been he would not have been a great president, or was not a great president, or was never really going to be capable of being a great president. His presidency probably would have been a lot better if he got his way, or wasn't being attacked and stopped at every single turn that he was able that he took. No one's perfect. No one's perfect, and Adams is far from it. But I would like to point out one more story, another story of the many, many stories that I think make particular individuals. So, Adams and Jefferson, they had this really long correspondence with one another. Very, very long. It would last decades, almost decades actually. I would say about a decade and a half. Quite a long time. And there's a lot of their messages to each other, for the most part, were like, "Hey, how you doing? How's the Rose Garden? How you doing?" You listen to that new Pink Floyd album. I'm just kidding. But sometimes they would talk. They would talk about, life, the books they're reading, and then sometimes it would devolve into topics of politics, and legacy. And the one thing that I will never question John Adams is his belief in the Republic. Excuse me. In a republic, and at the very least the ideas of what a republic is and the love of his country. I will never ever confuse that with anyone else. It's John Adams, republicanism and patriotism and liberty. That's John Adams, okay? He would fight for it to the very, very end. And I think he would, because you have to understand, when I meant that he was empathetically thinking at the end of his life, and he was coming to understand, a lot of the things about his life, and a lot of things that he failed, and a lot of things that he succeeded in. He thought about the ideas of republicanism, and he thought about because he's thinking about France, for instance. He's thinking about America, and in this particular correspondence with Jefferson, he's talking about going back and forth between why did France succeed, or why did France fail and America succeeded, and there's a whole bunch of different reasons that you can go into it, a whole bunch of different things that you can make from it, and he didn't stop thinking about this. He basically wanted to perfect it, even to the very end. And I was always wondering what his thought process was. I kind of wish he wrote more on these ideals for whatnot. And whatnot, at least on the modern, on his later ideas of republicanism. So one notable excerpt I would like to just point out really quickly is a really interesting excerpt that details the specifics of what I was just talking about. God, I'm getting tongue tied here. It's really late, and I have taco belly. Anyways, the one excerpt. Adams to Jefferson on September of 1823. It is, quote, "It is melancholy to contemplate the cruel wars, desolations of countries, and oceans of blood which must occur before rational principles and rational systems of government can prevail and be established. But as these are inevitable, we must content ourselves with the consolations from which you from sound and sure reasons so clearly suggest. These hopes are as well founded as our fears on the contrary evils. On the whole, the prospect is cheering. I have lately undertaken to reading Algernon Sidney on government, and there is a great difference in reading a book at 24 and 88. Cough, cough. Just kidding. This correspondence, it was mainly a discussion on kings and republics for the most part, and it's interesting. Adams makes a point of sympathy for kings, because you have to understand when he was younger, very drastically different youthful upbringing during the Revolution, they're no better. Because I'll put it to you this way, kings are no better than men. Kings were basically from God for the most part, and that they were divine to rule the world. And that that Adams basically thought he had some sympathy for them because, they did not know better. They were not aware of that reality, and they could not comprehend it because, when people are brought up in a particular light, if I was a king and if I was a prince, it's more likely that king and that prince is going to be kind of a dick and a douchebag. Let's just be honest, because, you're brought up in a particular way, and you're brought up to think that, hey, I am this divine ruler for the most part. And I just thought it was interesting that he had sympathy for the kings. He's always had some sympathy for the kings, notably King George and whatnot for reasons. But Jefferson, he was agreeing. But he also pointed out that he also understood, with part of his own naivety, that those who start a revolution rarely complete it, like America did. Believing if not ruled by men like them or a stable body, it will fail. Or, in the case of the French example, Napoleon Bonaparte, which they actually discuss in length during this entire exchange with each other, would rule. And Adams, I think, always wondered, as many people back then, whether it could work, whether they knew the effect that they would have on the world. And, many of the European nations and countries experienced, themselves, their eventual revolutionary attempts around this particular time, the Monroe Doctrine, etc., etc. It's a very tumultuous time when they were writing in this particular correspondence, not just the colonies themselves, and I can always point to, like, why did we succeed as a country versus why France succeeded. And I think Adams is just pointing out that we succeeded because of, I guess in some way, shape, or form, the Republic. We had all these safeguards put in, for a reason. He's like, I'm not the biggest fan of the Constitution, but you know what? Once you create something the way that we did, this happens, etc., etc. And in some ways, because France attempted to do the exact same things, but it was much weaker documents, and basically Napoleon just became king for the most part. That's a complicated story in itself, and I'd like to do an episode on Napoleon eventually too. But effectively speaking, what they were talking about, they started something. It's kind of interesting to think about when, they're very keenly aware of the effect that they're going to have on people, and that they've had the effect on people, Imagine being like the kind of person that starts something like a fad or becomes trending on YouTube or like on Instagram, or you do some, like, imagine being the person that started the cinnamon challenge, just think about that and being like, oh man, people are following this. Interesting. I wonder why, It's the same concept for a lot of these people, except for, government changing and actual world changing political philosophies and ideologies, I find that very fascinating. And for them, it's interesting. Adams, to an extent, Jefferson, they both never stopped thinking. They never stopped to try to understand, patriotism, liberty, what freedom meant, And I point this out because I don't think we think about this. People after their large historical moments, they fade into obscurity with the ever-changing world, Like John Adams lived to be 90. He lived all the way to 1826. He lived long enough to see the Missouri Compromise, a new generation of politicians like, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Daniel Webster, all those people. You got to see Andrew Jackson and his own son effectively lead the new generation. He lived long enough to see 13 colonies become 24 states. He lived long enough to see his own son become president, and he was barely 10 when the actual Revolutionary War started. John Quincy Adams. And I think this particular exchange is interesting because I think Adams in particular always wanted to talk about this to Jefferson, which Jefferson always humored him at times. And although they would rather discuss everyday life, among other things, than reflect on what they accomplished, That's just Adams, though. He's always thinking. He's always trying to figure it out. And I think that's just how he worked, which is why I wanted to bring up this particular moment in time. I think if he got another 4 years, I will admit, although I think he would have been a failure as a president, I am very curious to see how he would have worked. I'm very curious to see how a lot of things would have changed, how he would have maybe legislated a little bit differently, or the ideas that he had. He's always thinking. He's a thinker. He's an actual original independent mind in a lot of aspects. I think that's why he and Hamilton, tend to think in a much more, they're part of the same party. They actually believe in a lot of the same principles. It was just how, it was literally just personal issues that really drove those two people apart for the most part in terms of their the same party political affiliation. It's interesting. And I think ultimately, that's what Adams' legacy should be. Man, he never stopped. He never stopped thinking, and above all else, more or less, he never stopped being a patriot who fought for liberty, and never stopped trying to understand what that liberty meant, and the human condition that came along with it, obviously. I think it was finally until his old age did I think Adams come to understand these principles of freedom and ultimately the harsh costs that a revolution would take. Everything that happened back then that Adams figures out now, it's everyday custom to us. That's how I see it. And that's why I think he's such a big, huge figure. Oh, Adams. Well, ultimately, the harsh cost of the revolution would take. He was pessimistic, ironically, about revolutions at that point. Because you have to understand, the French failed, a bunch of the other colonies would fail. The Haitian Revolution would be complicated, more or less, for the most part. And especially in Europe, when the rise of the Industrial Revolution and people were trying to revolt, a lot of, I guess you could say, liberal revolutions to start these republics and whatnot all failed for the most part. Which then necessitated the many autocracies to somewhat unite to quell these rebellions and sorts that necessitated in part of the Monroe Doctrine. Like I said, everything goes along with each other. Everything just goes. It's fucking insane. History. There's a lot of ground to cover. I'll get to the Monroe Doctrine when I get to James Monroe, though. In his mindset, though, people died for nothing. He somewhat thought, reflecting on the many lives lost in pursuit of freedom. And it's unfortunate, and I think he's a little bit apprehensive in some ways. Because when people lose their freedom, like lives for freedom, you should never lose your life for freedom. But if it fails, then, you have to ask yourself and point out, what's the point? What's the point? And I think he struggled with that for quite a long time. If I will say this, though, to end on a positive note, the book Discourses Concerning Government, I haven't read that book, but apparently it's a historically significant work that defends republicanism. Algernon Sidney, he's one of these classical enlightened thinkers along with John Locke. He lost his life. He was put on trial apparently before actually finishing the work and beheaded for his stance against the crown. Liberty. And that is the key that I think Adams hoped would be his legacy. If anything, that future generations should follow an advocacy of freedom, democracy, one more time, liberty. Well, not democracy, not like democracy in the sense that, we think of it. Or, I guess what I'm trying to say, not majority rule democracy, but democracy in terms of equality for all and real, true liberty and patriotism. No biscuits. Thank you guys, and hope you guys come back for episode 3.